He died from a knife wound to the stomach, near the fridge with the Coke. Then he woke up on a stone floor in a cave, where three green creatures with rusty cleavers were standing over him, arguing over which part of his body each would get. Dan sits up. The creatures jump back, and the first thing he does is not run or scream, but crawl over to sniff the cauldron in the corner. Something murky and gray is bubbling in the cauldron. Steam rises reluctantly, as if ashamed. Dan sniffs. His eyebrows creep up, then down. He squints because his brain refuses to classify this smell. This isn't food. It isn't even an attempt at food. It's been boiled in water, without salt, without fat, without a single thought in the mind of whoever made it. For 20 years he stood at the stove. For 20 years he chopped, peeled, and cooked. And now he's dead in a foreign world. And he's about to be devoured by three green dwarves who don't even know how to boil water properly. Dan stands up. He picks up a wooden spoon from the floor. He scoops some up. He blows on it. He tastes it. He's silent for a long time. The goblins exchange glances. The eldest grips his cleaver tighter. And Dan puts down the spoon and looks at them the way a person looks who is physically in pain from what he just put in his mouth. He pokes his finger at the cauldron and speaks. The goblins don't understand a word, but the tone is universal. That's how people curse in any language of any world. Then he points at the cleaver in the elder's hand, at himself, at the pot, and makes a gesture that's understood everywhere. Give me the knife. I'll do it right. The elder goblin stares with a cloudy yellow eye. 2 seconds. 5. 10. And holds out the cleaver, hilt first. They've got nothing to lose. Lunch is crap anyway. Dan twirls the cleaver in his hand. Heavy, dull, rusty. Nothing here is fit for the kitchen. He rummages through the sacks. In the first, dry seaweed with a metallic aftertaste. In the second, dried beetles the size of a finger. He crushes one between his fingers and sniffs it. A nutty smell beneath the chitin. Interesting. A root vegetable that looks rotten is lying under the stairs. Dan scrapes the skin with his fingernail. Inside is white, dense flesh. He takes a bite. Starchy, slightly sweet, like a lotus root. Perfect. He pours the slop from the cauldron right onto the floor. The goblins grumble. Who cares? He washes the cauldron with water from the barrel, puts it back on the fire, points to a pile of bones by the wall. The elder hobbles over and pulls out 2 bones as long as an arm. Dark red, almost brown. Dan sniffs. Game. Rich, powerful game. In the fracture, the crimson brain of some unseen beast. Collagen. Fat. A depth that will reveal itself after hours of cooking. He throws the bones into the cauldron, pours in water, and covers it with a flat stone. And now, the hardest part. Waiting. The goblins sit along the wall and stare at him as if he were a strange animal. The broth comes to a boil. A dirty brown foam rises. Dan skims it off with a spoon. More. And more. The earless goblin approaches, pokes the foam with a finger, and grunts questioningly. Dan shakes his head. Dirt. No, don't. And for the first time, a flicker of interest appears in the goblin's dull eyes. Dan turns down the heat. He pulls out a couple of coals. The broth shouldn't be boiling. It should be simmering. Only then will the bones give up everything. An hour passes. 2. 3. The cave fills with a scent these walls have never known. The goblins fall silent. They stop scratching and picking their teeth. They sit motionless, staring at the cauldron. Their nostrils flare. The elder swallows. 5 hours. The broth turns golden. 7. The scent envelops the cave like a warm blanket. At the entrance, someone sniffs around outside. The elder barks into the darkness and the commotion subsides. 12 hours. The broth becomes clear as amber. Dan swallows himself, and it calms him. If you want it yourself, then it's right. 15 hours. He pulls out the bones and they crumble in his hands. All the gelatin has gone into the broth. He strains the liquid through a coarse cloth. Now, the beetles. He heats a flat stone over the coals. He pours a handful onto it. A crackling sound. A nutty caramel scent with a hint of bitterness. The beetles darken and crackle. Dan tries one. Roasted hazelnuts, mixed with smoke and spice. Good. Very good. He arranges the root slices across 3 bowls. Soaked seaweed on top. He pours in the golden broth, a handful of crunchy beetles, and finally, a drop of fat in the center of each bowl spreads into a perfect circle, like a little sun. 18 hours of work. Dan hands the first bowl to the elder. The elder takes both hands. Clear golden broth, white root, dark seaweed, crunchy beetles, a drop of fat like the sun. He had never seen anything like it. Food in his world was gray and murky and existed only to keep him from dying. He brings the bowl to his lips. The first sip. First, warmth. Then fat. Then depth. Something dark and meaty, infinitely complex. 18 hours of cooking compressed into a single sip. The goblin freezes. His single yellow eye slowly widens. A second sip, with seaweed and root, a crunch, softness, and this impossible broth. A murky tear rolls down his green, wrinkled cheek and falls into the bowl. Old Grurg doesn't wipe it away. For over 100 years, he's broken his enemy's bones, gnawed on raw meat, and drunk water from puddles. He's never cried. He drinks it all down to the dregs. He licks the bowl clean. He is silent for a long time. Then he pulls a real dagger from his belt, short with a bone handle and a dark blade, the only valuable thing he owns. And he holds it out to Dan, hilt first. Dan doesn't understand. Grurg pokes himself in the chest, then points the dagger toward Dan, then sweeps his arm around the entire cave. You're under my protection, my clan, my word. Dan takes the dagger. The hilt is warm from another's hand. He nods. By evening, others begin to arrive at the cave. First, 2 from the neighboring tunnel. They stand at the entrance and sniff the air. By nightfall, 30 goblins from 4 clans have crowded in. Some haven't spoken to each other in years. Some are sworn enemies. But they all sit in the same cave, waiting quietly and patiently. Because the smell from the cauldron is stronger than their enmity, Dan is cooking the second batch. There aren't enough bones, so the broth is weaker. He makes up for it by throwing bugs right into the cauldron. He adds seaweed for body. He cuts the root thicker. He works in silence. His hands move precisely, without a single wasted motion. The goblins watch those hands as if spellbound. No one has ever moved like that over food, with such care, as if what's bubbling in the cauldron matters. Dan hands out 30 bowls. The cave fills with slurping, crunching, and quiet rumbling, and that special silence between mouthfuls that only happens when they're eating something truly delicious. Some are crying. Dan sits against the wall and watches the 30 green creatures with fangs and scars who are silently eating his broth. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what kind of world this is. He doesn't know if he'll make it to morning. But he knows one thing. These guys have just eaten. For real. Maybe for the first time in their lives. And that's enough to get started. Dan hadn't slept. 30 goblins were snoring in a heap on the cave floor. The air was heavy with their breath and body heat. Blue torches on the walls were burning out. Dan sat by the extinguished cauldron and thought. Grurg's dagger lay on his lap. The dark metal glinted in the fading light. He ran his finger along the blade. Sharp. Much sharper than the cleavers. He could work with this. Dan stood up and quietly made his way to the exit. The hide at the entrance was heavy and damp. He pushed it aside and stepped outside. Before him lay a world he hadn't seen yesterday, because yesterday he had been lying on the floor staring at goblins with cleavers. The cave, onto a rocky ledge, a valley stretched out below, gray and brown under a heavy sky the color of old lead. No sun, no blue sky. Light came from somewhere behind the clouds, dull and even, as if someone had turned on a fluorescent light behind dirty glass. Mountains were visible in the distance, black, with red streaks running down their slopes, as if the mountains were bleeding. The air smelled different than in the cave. The sulfur was weaker. Instead, there was something earthy and damp, and something else, something metallic. Dan looked down. A river flowed at the foot of the ledge, dark, almost black water. Some kind of plants grew on the surface, glowing, pale green, algae. He made a mental note. To the right of the ledge, a path led down the slope. To the left, a basalt wall rose upward. Above the cave entrance, someone had scratched a symbol into the rock, a crude drawing of a skull with one eye, the sign of the Grurg clan, apparently. Dan went back inside. Grurg was no longer asleep. The old goblin sat by the wall and looked at Dan, silently. Dan sat down beside him. They couldn't have a normal conversation. Grurg's common tongue consisted of about 50 words, and Dan didn't understand half of them. But after 20 years working in a restaurant in Los Angeles, Dan had learned to communicate with people using a minimum of words, with Mexican dishwashers who didn't know English, with Japanese chefs who believed that talking in the kitchen was generally unnecessary, with Grandma Halmoni, who taught him silently by gesturing with her hands. Dan gestured to Grurg. I need food. I need groceries, bones, plants, everything that can be found. Grurg watched, then he nodded. He stood up. He clapped his hands 3 times. The goblins began to wake up, grumbling and yawning. Grurg gave orders in short, barking phrases. 6 goblins stood up and left the cave. An hour later, they began to return. The first one dragged in an armful of the same seaweed, glowing and wet. Dan sniffed it, salty, with a slight iodine smell. Good. The second brought a basket of beetles, alive. They rustled and scurried about. Dan peered into the basket. 3 kinds. Large brown ones with hard wings, medium-sized black ones without wings, and small reddish ones. He took one of each kind and crushed them between his fingers. He sniffed. The first kind smelled nutty, the same one he'd roasted yesterday. The second had no particular smell, but an oily texture, fat, a source of fat. The third smelled sharp and pungent, almost like garlic. Dan raised an eyebrow. A spice. He had a spice. The third goblin returned with a carcass, a small beast the size of a large rabbit, 6 legs, scales instead of fur, a thick, meaty tail. Dan examined the carcass. The meat beneath the scales was dark red, almost purple. He cut off a piece with his dagger and tasted it raw. Tough, fibrous, but with a powerful, meaty flavor. It would become tender with prolonged cooking. The fourth brought mushrooms, white, glowing with a faint blue light. They had apparently grown deep within the cave systems. Dan broke one open. The flesh was dense. The smell was earthy and deep, almost truffle-like. He bit off a tiny piece. He waited. He looked at Grurg and pointed at the mushroom, then at his stomach, and made a questioning face. Grurg understood. He nodded. He poked himself in the chest. He indicated that he eats these mushrooms, so they're not poisonous, at least not to goblins. Dan ate a bigger piece. He waited 10 minutes. His stomach didn't hurt. His head didn't spin. It's safe. The fifth goblin dragged over a sack of root vegetables, those very ones, dirty and rotten looking. The sixth brought a jug of water, clean, from an underground spring, apparently. Dan laid out all the ingredients in front of him. He squatted down and stared at them for a long time. This was his mise en place, his workstation. A bone dagger instead of a knife, clay bowls instead of dishes, a stone floor instead of a cutting board, a flat stone over coals instead of a stove. and a set of ingredients he hadn't even known existed just yesterday. But the principle was the same, always the same. Understand the product, unlock the product, combine them so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Dan got to work. He cut the carcass of the six-legged beast into pieces, meat separate, bones separate, fat separate, tail separate. The tail turned out to be almost entirely fat and collagen, like an oxtail. Dan put the tail and bones into a pot of water, a new broth. He crushed the oily black beetles in a clay bowl. The result was a dark, thick paste. He sniffed it. Oil. Fat. This was his cooking fat, a substitute for both butter and vegetable oil. He ground the red beetles into a powder on a flat stone. The result was a reddish dust with a sharp garlic smell and a slight burning sensation on the tongue. A spice, the first spice in his arsenal. He sliced the mushrooms thinly, into slices. Grg's dagger cut perfectly. The blade was sharper than any chef's knife Dan had ever held. He sliced 300 grams of mushrooms in 4 minutes, even slices of uniform thickness. The goblins gathered around and watched. There were already 15 of them, those who had spent the night here and a few newcomers. The new ones had come on the scent of yesterday's broth, or on rumors. Dan paid no attention. There are no outsiders in the kitchen. There is only the product and the process. He sliced the meat into thin strips across the grain. He coated each strip in beetle oil, sprinkled a pinch of red powder. He placed them on the hot stone. A sizzle. The aroma hit instantly. Meaty, spicy, with a nutty note from the beetle oil. The goblins leaned forward. Dan cooked the meat quickly, 30 seconds on each side. The strips remained pink on the inside, a caramelized crust on the outside. He took the meat off the stone and arranged it in bowls on top of the sliced mushrooms. He splashed hot broth from the cauldron into each bowl. The broth wasn't quite ready yet. It needed another 6 hours, but even after 4 hours of simmering, it was already better than anything the goblins had tasted before. Roasted nut beetles on top, and a drop of beetle oil. He handed the first bowl to Grg again. The chieftain took it and sniffed it. He looked at the contents. It was more complex than yesterday's broth. More textures, more elements. Pink meat on white mushrooms in a golden broth. Crunchy beetles, a dark drop of oil. Grg tasted it. The meat. Soft on the outside and pink on the inside. He had never eaten meat that wasn't tough and gray, chewed down to the consistency of a rope or swallowed raw. This meat. And the taste was sharp and deep and meaty and something else. Something for which Grg had no word, because that word had never existed in his language. The word was delicious. Dan handed out the remaining bowls. The cave fell silent. Only the sounds of eating, slurping broth, the crunch of bugs, quiet smacking. One of the new goblins set down an empty bowl and sat motionless with his eyes closed. His face bore an expression Dan had seen 1,000 times in his father's restaurant. The expression of a man eating something so good that he needs a moment of silence afterward. After breakfast, Grg approached Dan. He searched for words for a long time. Then he took Dan by the sleeve and pulled him toward the exit. They walked along the path down from the cave, past a river with black water, across a rocky wasteland. Grg hobbled ahead, moving quickly for his age. 4 goblin warriors walked on either side. Guards. Dan walked in silence, looking around. The world was strange and gloomy and beautiful in its own way. Rock formations jutted out of the ground like twisted fingers. Plants were sparse but vivid. Red lichens covered the rocks. Glowing moss grew in the crevices. Occasionally, creatures flashed by. Something nimble and many-legged darted into a crevice in the rock. Something large and dark stirred in the distance and vanished. The goblin guards tensed at every rustle. Hands on their daggers, eyes on the alert. They walked for about 2 hours. The path led them to a crossroads. 3 roads converged at a single point. Each road led off in its own direction. One to the north toward the Black Mountains, one to the southeast toward some distant glow on the horizon, one to the west toward a dense, dark forest. In the middle of the crossroads stood a house, stone, 1 story, with thick walls of gray stone and a flat roof, a dark wooden door, 2 windows, a chimney. The house was old, very old. The stones were covered with moss and lichen. The door was cracked and warped. 1 window was broken. But the walls stood firm. The foundation hadn't settled. The roof hadn't caved in. Grurg stopped 100 paces from the house. He didn't go any further. The goblin guards stopped too. Grurg pointed at the house. Then he pointed at Dan. Then he swept his arm around everything and shook his head from side to side. The meaning was clear. The house is for you. We're not going in there. Dan looked at the house. He looked at Grurg. He pointed at the house and at the goblins and made a questioning face. Why aren't you coming? Grurg said 1 word. Dan didn't know the word, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Dan looked at the house again. An ordinary stone house at a crossroads. Nothing to be afraid of. He shrugged and walked forward. With every step, he expected something to happen. A trap, magic, a monster behind the door. Nothing. He reached the door. He pushed it. The door creaked and swung open. It was dark inside. Dan stepped over the threshold and froze. The floor was clean. Not just clean, spotless. No dust, no debris, no footprints. The stone floor looked as if someone had swept it a minute ago. But the house was at least several decades old, if not older. Dan took another step. To his left stood a hearth, a large stone hearth, and above it, something happened. An even blue flame flared up on its own, quietly, without a crackle, without smoke. It just appeared, as if it had been waiting. Dan stopped and watched the fire. Even, steady, perfect for cooking. He slowly walked around the room, a single room, large, walls of the same gray stone. In the far corner, a stone bench, shelves along the wall, empty. Next to the hearth, a long stone table, smooth, as if polished. A work surface, a perfect work surface. There was a niche under the table. For the first week, Dan worked 18 hours a day. In the morning, he woke up on the stone bench in the house at the crossroads. The hearth burned with an even blue flame. It never went out. Dan simply adjusted the intensity of the fire by moving the cauldron closer or farther away. Dan didn't know when to burn stronger and when to burn weaker. Dan didn't understand. But on the 3rd day, he noticed a pattern. When he placed the cauldron on the hearth, the fire intensified to the desired temperature. When he removed it, the fire died down to a minimum, just like an induction stove. Dan decided not to think about it and simply accept it as a given. He had more important things to worry about than the physics of the local fire. The goblins of Grurg became his suppliers. Every morning, 2 or 3 goblins would show up at the house. They never came inside. They stood at the threshold and set down what they had brought. Bones, meat, beetles, mushrooms, seaweed, root vegetables. Sometimes something new. On the 4th day, they brought berries, small and black and bitter. Dan tasted one, sour and bitter, with a tartness on the tongue. He thought for a moment. Then he mashed the berries into a paste and added it to the broth. The bitterness was gone, but the sourness remained. The broth became brighter, cleaner. The sourness cut through the fat. Perfect. On the 5th day, they brought something resembling honey, a thick, dark amber liquid in a clay pot. Dan tasted it on the tip of his finger. Sweet, very sweet, but not cloying. with a floral note and a slight smoky aftertaste. He didn't know where the goblins had gotten it, but now he had something sweet. They're salty, they're sour, they're spicy, they're sweet. He extracted umami from the broth, the mushrooms, and the beetle oil. All 5 basic tastes were there. Dan could get to work. He began experimenting, a new dish every day. He tasted every dish himself. Then he gave it to Grurg, then to the rest of the goblins. He watched for their reactions, what worked, what didn't. When cooked for a long time, the meat of the hellish boar became as tender as braised beef. But the flavor was more intense, almost too intense for a human palate. Dan found the balance. Thin slices of meat in a light broth with seaweed. The meat provided richness, while the broth diluted it and brought out the best. The cave mushrooms turned out to be incredible. When sautéed in beetle oil, they gave off an aroma that Dan could only describe as a truffle crossed with roasted garlic. A single mushroom per bowl of broth transformed a simple soup into something for which goblins would drop everything and rush to the crossroads. The red powder from the beetles became his main spice. He added it to everything. A pinch in the broth, a pinch on the meat, a pinch on the mushrooms. Each time, the dish changed. It became livelier and brighter. He learned to dry the seaweed from the Black River on a stone by the hearth. When dried, it became crispy and salty, the perfect topping, the perfect textural addition. By the end of the first week, Dan could cook 4 full-fledged dishes: bone broth with meat and seaweed, sautéed mushrooms with beetle oil and red powder, braised 6-legged beast tail with root vegetables, and a simple broth with eggs. He discovered the eggs by accident. One of the goblins brought a nest with 5 large speckled eggs. Dan didn't ask whose they were. He cracked one open. The yolk was dark orange, almost red. Dan boiled it in the simmering broth. 3 minutes. The yolk remained runny. The white had set. He placed the egg in a bowl of broth and cut it open. The runny orange yolk flowed into the golden broth. Grurg saw this and froze, with his mouth agape. For a creature that had spent its entire life swallowing raw eggs whole, the sight of a cut-open egg with runny yolk in hot broth was something of a religious revelation. Rumors spread. Dan could tell by the number of goblins who came every day. 30 on the first day, 40 on the third, 60 on the 5th. By the end of the week, nearly 100. They came from all the surrounding caves, from clans with which Grurg's clan had not interacted for generations, from tunnels so far that the journey took half a day. They came in silence. They stood in line on the street in front of the house. They waited, patiently, quietly. Dan couldn't feed everyone. There weren't enough ingredients. There was only one pot. He had 2 hands. He established a system. Those who brought ingredients ate first. It was fair. Bring a bone, get a bowl. Bring mushrooms, get a bowl. Bring something new and interesting, get a bowl, and a grateful nod from Dan, which for some reason came to mean more to the goblins than the bowl itself. The system worked. The goblins began to compete, not for food, for the right to bring the best ingredient. One dragged in a huge bone from some beast the size of a bear. The brain inside the bone was the size of a fist. Dan simmered that bone for 3 days. The broth turned out so thick that it solidified at room temperature. Dan cut it into cubes. Concentrated broth, a demi-glace from another world. He dropped 1 cube into a bowl of boiling water and stirred. Instant broth. The goblins watched as if it were a magic trick. Another goblin brought a new kind of mushroom. Not white, but purple. Dan tasted it. The flavor was strange, sweet and sour at the same time. When sautéed, the sweetness intensified and the sourness disappeared. Caramelized mushrooms. Dan added them to the stewed meat. The combination of tough meat and delicate sweetness created a contrast that made Grurg's hands tremble. A third goblin brought a plant, a long stem with narrow leaves. Dan rubbed it between his fingers. The scent, sharp, herbal, like a mixture of rosemary and mint. He tossed 2 leaves into the boiling broth. The aroma changed instantly. From heavy and meaty, the broth became fresh and complex. Dan called this plant gray mint because the leaves were gray. By the 10th day, the problem had become obvious. The house at the crossroads was too small. One pot, one stove, one table. Dan cooked from morning till night, and still half of those who came left empty-handed. Some waited for hours, standing outside in the wind, silently, patiently. Dan saw them through the window and felt the same thing every time he had felt at his father's restaurant when the line stretched out the door. Anger at himself for not being able to go faster. Grurg came to him on the evening of the 10th day. He brought 2 others with him, a young goblin girl with nimble fingers and a skinny, tall goblin with 4 arms. Grurg pointed at them, then at the kitchen, then at Dan. Helpers. Dan looked at them. The goblin girl stared at him with huge yellow eyes. The 4-armed one shifted from foot to foot. Dan pointed to the root vegetable and made a slicing gesture. He handed her a dagger. She took it. The first slice was crooked and thick. Dan gently took her hand and guided it. Thinner. Straighter. She tried again. Better. One more time. Even better. By the 5th root vegetable, her cuts were acceptable. Not perfect, but acceptable. He assigned the beetles to 4-armed, roasting on a hot stone. 4-armed stirred the beetle simultaneously on 2 stones. The pace doubled. Dan nodded. It's working. By the evening of the 12th day, the 3 of them had fed 120 goblins. When the last bowl was handed out, Dan sat down on the floor by the hearth. His legs were buzzing. His back ached. His hands smelled of beetle oil and gray mint. He was happy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this way. Not satisfaction from work, not weary pride, but happiness, simple and warm, like broth. Grurg sat down beside him, silently. They sat like that for about 10 minutes. Then Grurg spoke, choosing his words slowly. He spoke in broken common, with long pauses. Dan listened. He understood every 3rd word, but he caught the gist. Grurg was saying that goblins had always been down below. All the other demons were up above. The higher ones in castles, the middle ones in the cities, the goblins in the caves. They were eaten when there was nothing else to eat. They were killed when people were bored. They weren't considered alive. For 100 years, Grurg had led his clan through the caves, hiding, survived, lost children and grandchildren, ate murky slop from a cauldron, and believed that was just the way the world was. And now he sits on the floor next to a creature from another world who brews golden broth and feeds it to his people. And his people stand in line not out of fear, but out of desire. And in his clan's caves, for the first time in 100 years, it doesn't smell of dampness and death, but of something warm and good. Grurg fell silent. Dan sat quietly. He didn't understand every word, but he understood everything, because it was the same conversation he'd heard 1,000 times in another life, from Aunt Harn, from the old men in Koreatown, from the weary laborers who came to his father for a bowl of ramen at midnight, a conversation that sounds the same in any language. Thank you for letting me come. Thank you for the warmth here. Thank you for giving me a place to sit. Dan stood up. He walked over to the hearth. He had saved 1 bowl. On the 14th day, it rained. Not ordinary rain. The water fell from the sky, dark red and heavy. It smelled of iron and left rust-colored streaks on the stones. The goblins hid in their caves. No one came for food. Dan stood in the doorway of the house and watched the red streams running down the roads at the crossroads. A strange world. Red rain, blue fire, green goblins, and he was in the middle of it all, with a dagger and a cauldron. The rain fell for 3 days. For 3 days, Dan was alone. He used that time. He cleaned the kitchen. He sharpened his dagger on a stone. He sorted through his supplies. He counted. He had meat for 2 days, bones for 1 broth, few mushrooms, few beetles. Root vegetables would last a week, an abundance of seaweed because the river was nearby. He needed to expand his supplies. He needed a storage system. He needed a way to dry things. He needed fermentation. Fermentation. Dan paused. He looked at the stone container of water, then at the salt, then at the root vegetables. He sliced 3 root vegetables into thin strips, covered them with salt, stirred them, placed them in a clay pot, and weighed them down with a stone. He left it in the corner of the kitchen. The temperature in the house was stable, cooler than outside, but not cold, perfect for fermentation.
If the chemistry of this world is even slightly similar to Earth's, lactic acid fermentation will begin in 3 or 4 days. Lactic acid fermentation would begin. If not, he would lose the 3 root vegetables. It was worth the risk. He prepared another pot, mushrooms sliced and covered with salt, and a third, seaweed with red berries and salt. 3 experiments, 3 potential new products. Dan wrote everything down, not on paper because there was no paper. He found a flat gray stone and scratched on it with a dagger. Primitive, but it works. Ingredient, method, result, time. He was compiling a cookbook of the world he had stumbled into. By the morning of the 4th day, the rain had stopped. Dan stepped outside. The air after the rain was clean, fresh. The metallic smell was gone. In its place was something floral and cool. And then he saw her. The girl was lying on the road 20 paces from the house, curled up in a ball, wet, dirty, small. 2 short horns on her head, one broken in half. Her hair was black and tangled. Her clothes were rags. Dan approached. She didn't move. He crouched down beside her. He felt her neck. She had a pulse, weak. Her skin was hot, a fever. Dan lifted her up. She weighed as much as a child, skin and bones. He carried her into the house and laid her on the bed. He covered her with a hide he dragged out of Grurg's cave on the 2nd day. He looked at her, young, very young. Her face was almost human, except for the horns and slightly pointed ears, and the emaciation. Dan had seen that kind of emaciation once before, in Los Angeles, homeless people under the bridge on 6th Street. A gauntness where every rib and every vertebra was visible. A gauntness that meant a person hadn't eaten properly in a very long time. He went to the hearth. He took a cube of frozen, concentrated broth from his supplies, dissolved it in hot water, added a pinch of salt, no more. A stomach that had been starving for a long time couldn't handle anything heavy. Just broth. Only liquid, only warmth. He returned to the cot and lifted her head. He brought the bowl to her lips. She didn't open her eyes, but the reflex kicked in. Her lips parted slightly. He poured the broth in small sips. She swallowed, slowly, with difficulty, but she swallowed. He fed her like this 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, in small portions, just broth. On the 2nd day, she opened her eyes, yellow, large, with vertical pupils. She looked at Dan and didn't move. He was sitting next to her on the floor, stirring something in a pot. She tried to stand up. Dan turned around. He shook his head. He gestured with his hand. Lie down. She lay back down. He brought her a bowl. This time, broth with thin slices of overcooked root vegetable, soft, so she wouldn't have to chew. She took the bowl with both hands. Her hands were shaking. She sniffed. She looked up at Dan. There was a question in her eyes. He nodded. Eat. She drank, slowly. When the broth was gone, she licked the bowl. Then she looked at Dan and opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She was trying to say something. Her voice wouldn't obey her, hoarse or simply out of practice.
Dan didn't rush her. He poured her some water. She drank. She coughed, and finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, in the same common language Grurg spoke, but clearer, more words, more intelligible. She said her name was Yuna. She asked where she was. Dan pointed to the house. He pointed to the hearth. He pointed to the cauldron. Then he pointed to himself and said his name. Dan. She repeated it. Dan. He nodded. Then he asked. It was the first complete sentence he had spoken in the common language in 2 weeks in this world. The words were clumsy and mispronounced, but he asked, "What is your name?" She blinked, as if she didn't understand the question. As if the question were in a foreign language, even though the words were the simplest. She was silent for a long time. Then she answered, "Yuna Sohe." Dan nodded and repeated her name in full. Yuna Sohe. She turned her back to the wall. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying silently. Dan didn't ask why. He knew why. He got up and went to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, he returned with a new bowl. Egg drop soup. The yolk was runny. The broth was hot. He set it down next to the cot. He said one word quietly. Eat. Yuna recovered quickly. On the 3rd day after waking up, she got out of bed. On the 4th, she began walking around the house. On the 5th, she stepped outside and stood for a long time, looking at the intersection. She began to speak more. Dan listened and learned. The common language turned out not to be that difficult. The structure is simple: subject, predicate, object. Few abstract words, many concrete ones. Yuna became his teacher. She told him the words, and he repeated them. Food, water, fire, knife, bowl, meat, bone, salt. These were the first words he needed. Then she told him more. She's a half-breed. Her mother is human. Her father is a lesser demon. The horns are from her father. The eyes are from her father. Face from her mother. Her mother died when Yuna was 7. She doesn't remember her father. Alone ever since, chased away from everywhere. Humans because of the horns. Demons because of the human blood. Neither here nor there. Nowhere. She was walking down the road when the red rain started. She fell. Doesn't remember how long she lay there. Woke up and something warm. Dan listened, nodded, didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the kitchen. He came back with 2 bowls. He set one in front of her. He took the second one for himself. He sat down across from her. He said in broken common, "There's a lot of work tomorrow. I need help." "You'll work here." Yuna looked at him. He was eating, calmly, as if what he'd just said was the most normal thing in the world. Not an offer out of pity, not charity. Work. Normal human work. Yuna picked up the bowl. She ate, silently. The next morning, Dan woke up to a sound. Someone was washing bowls by a stone water trough. Yuna stood barefoot on the cold floor, scrubbing a clay bowl with a bunch of seaweed. The bowls gleamed. She turned around when she heard him get up. "Good morning." Dan said it in the common language for the first time. "Good morning, Yuna." She froze for a second. Then she turned back to the bowls. But Dan noticed. The corners of her lips twitched, barely noticeable. First day on the job. Dan showed her everything: how to cut root vegetables, how to clean mushrooms, how to wash seaweed, how to tell when the broth was ready by its color and smell. Yuna picked things up quickly. Her hands were nimble, her movements were precise. She worked silently and with concentration. In half a day, she mastered chopping. In a day, sautéing bugs. By evening, she stood by the hearth, stirring the broth under Dan's supervision. He showed her how to skim the foam, how to regulate the heat by adjusting the pot's distance from the fire, how to gauge the temperature by the bubbles. She listened and remembered everything the first time. When the goblins came for their evening meal, Yuna handed out bowls for the first time in her life. She stood at the entrance to the house and handed each goblin a bowl of broth. The goblins looked at her in bewilderment. A half-breed, with horns, handing out food. But the food smelled so good that their bewilderment was quickly replaced by something else. Hunger. And then what comes after a satisfied hunger? Silence. Dan stood by the hearth and watched. Yuna moved with confidence, without fear, here, on the threshold of a stone house at the crossroads, handing out broth to creatures who, by all the laws of this world, should have despised her. She looked as if she had finally found a place where she could stand. After the last goblin received his bowl and left, Yuna returned to kitchen. Dan was preparing their shared dinner. Simple mushroom broth, nothing complicated. He set 2 bowls on the stone table. They sat across from each other. Yuna ate quietly. Then she looked up. She asked, "Why did you pick me up?" Dan looked at her. He shrugged. He said in broken common, "She was lying on the road. It was cold." She shook her head. "That's not an answer. People walk by. They always walk by." Dan finished his broth. He set down his bowl. He thought for a moment. Then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "Because broth for one is just soup, but broth for 2 is dinner." Yuna looked at him. Then she lowered her eyes to the empty bowl. She said quietly, "I'll work hard." Dan nodded. He had no doubt. He checked the pot of fermented root vegetable that same evening. He opened the lid. The smell hit him sharply and sourly. He tasted it. Sour, crunchy, with a depth of flavor that the fresh root vegetable lacked. The fermentation was working. The laws of nature were the same here. The bacteria were doing their job. Lactic acid was transforming a simple root vegetable into something completely new. Dan smiled. The mushrooms had fermented successfully as well. They had become softer and acquired a sharp, piquant flavor. A month had passed. The house at the crossroads had changed. Dan no longer recognized the place where bare stone walls and empty shelves once stood. A sign had appeared at the entrance, a piece of flat stone on which Yuna had scratched 2 words in the common language. She had wanted to write simply "food" here, but Dan shook his head. The place had to have a name. He thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, a cat came to the house, skinny, black, with 1 ear. It sat on the threshold and wouldn't leave. Dan brought it a bowl of broth. The cat drank. It stayed. The place got a name, Cat's Crossroads. Order emerged inside. Pots of fermented foods lined the walls. 10 pots. Root fruits, mushrooms, seaweed, berries, each at its own stage, each marked with a notch on the side. The shelves above the hearth were filled. Dried seaweed, red powder made from beetles, gray mint, cubes of congealed broth, beetle oil in a clay jug, a small pot of honey. Under the table, in a stone niche, there was always water and salt. Dan had polished the workbench with a stone until it was smooth. 3 knives lay on the table. Grurg's dagger for delicate work, a cleaver for bones, and a new knife that a blacksmith from a distant goblin clan had made for him in exchange for 10 bowls of broth. The knife was rough but sharp, made of dark metal, a bit heavy, but Dan had gotten used to it. The hearth was still burning on its own, a blue flame, steady and obedient. Next to the hearth, Dan had built a second brazier out of stones. On it, he seared meat and mushrooms. The fire for the brazier was ordinary, coals from wood that the goblins chopped in the western forest. Dan had discovered that the coals from each tree produced a different heat. Some burned quickly and fiercely, for quick searing. Others smoldered long and steady, for slow braising. He marked them and kept them separate. Yuna worked side by side with him. She had changed over the past month. Her ribs no longer jutted out. Her face had filled out. Her eyes were no longer empty. She moved through the kitchen with confidence. She knew where everything was. She knew when to skim the foam, when to turn the meat, when the broth was ready by color and smell. She couldn't cook on her own yet, but as an assistant, she was flawless. And she talked. A lot. Constantly. To the goblins, to Dan, to the cat, with the pot. She talked to the pot while stirring the broth. Dan heard her muttering quietly. "Come on, be delicious. You can do it." Dan didn't say anything. At his father's restaurant, the dishwasher Miguel talked to the plates. It was normal. The goblin assistants had grown up too. A female goblin named Pika had mastered slicing at the level of a decent apprentice. Four-armed Dorg had become a master at roasting bugs. His 4 arms made him ideal for multitasking. He could simultaneously stir bugs on a stone, slice seaweed, and stacking coals and scratching his nose. The line at Cat's Crossroads no longer consisted solely of goblins. In the 3rd week, the first non-goblin arrived. Tall, skinny, with gray, scaly skin and a long tail. A lizard man. He stood at the end of the line, looking around nervously. The goblins were eyeing him. Lizardmen and goblins didn't get along. Something to do with territory and hunting grounds. Dan noticed the tension. He stepped out from behind the hearth. He approached the lizard man. The lizard man backed away. Dan raised his hand. Calm down. Then he pointed to the house, pointed to the bowl, pointed to the table. Come in, sit down, eat. The lizard man came in. He sat down by the wall, far away from the goblins. Dan brought him a bowl, broth with stewed meat and fermented mushrooms. The lizard man sniffed. His long, forked tongue slid over the bowl. His eyes widened. He began to eat. A minute later, the bowl was empty. He looked up at Dan, and in those yellow reptilian eyes, Dan saw what he had seen in Grurg's eyes on the first day. Surprise, shock, and something else, something for which the lizard man had no word. The next day, the lizard man brought 2. 3 days later, there were 8. A week later, 15. At first, the goblins grumbled. Territory, their place, their cook. Dan solved it simply. In the evening, when everyone had left, he gathered Grurg and the senior lizard man. He placed a bowl in front of each of them, identical, from the same pot, with the same broth. Then he pointed at both of them. Then at the house. Then he spoke in the common language, which had improved significantly over the past month. Everyone here is equal. Whoever comes, eats. Whoever doesn't agree, doesn't eat. Grurg looked at the lizard man. The lizard man looked at Grurg. Both looked at their bowls. Both picked them up and began to eat. The problem was solved. Not because they had become friends, but because neither of them wanted to lose their place at the table. By the end of the first month, Dan was serving about 150 creatures a day. Goblins, lizardmen, a few kobolds, one huge shaggy demon with moose antlers whose species Dan never managed to identify. This demon came every day at exactly noon. He sat outside because he couldn't fit through the door. Yuna brought him the largest bowl they had. He took it with 2 fingers. He ate neatly. He left in silence. Once he came and brought a log. He placed it by the threshold. He left. The log turned out to be made of dense redwood. Dan put it on the shelves. The menu expanded. New dishes were added to the broth and roast. Braised meat with fermented root vegetables. Mushroom miso soup. Slices of root vegetable fried in beet oil, crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Seaweed marinated in berry juice with salt. And the main discovery of the month. On the 20th day, one of the goblins brought a bag of something small and gray. Grains. Dan took a handful. Round, small, like rice. He boiled the handful in water. It turned into porridge. Starchy, neutral in taste. Like rice. Gray rice. Not white, not perfect, but rice. Dan has rice. He stood in the kitchen holding a bowl of gray porridge in his hands and thought. Rice and miso soup. Rice and stewed meat. Rice and sautéed mushrooms. Rice and egg. Rice and everything. He could make ramen. Not the classic kind, without wheat noodles. But rice can be ground. You can make dough from rice flour. And noodles from the dough. He ground the grains between two stones. Hard work. Hours of work. His hands ached. But he got flour. Gray, fine. He added water. Kneaded the dough. Dense and elastic. Rolled it out with a dagger on a stone table. A thin sheet. Cut it into strips. Noodles. Coarse. Uneven. But noodles. He tossed a handful into the boiling broth. Cooked them for 3 minutes. Pulled them out. Tasted them. The texture wasn't perfect. A little crumbly. He needed to knead the dough more. But the taste. The noodles had absorbed the broth. They had become part of it. It was noodle soup. It was the closest thing to ramen he could make in this world. He filled a bowl. Mushroom miso broth. Noodles made from gray grains. Braised meat on top. Slices of fermented root vegetable. Seaweed. Fried beetles. A drop of beetle oil. Half an egg with a runny yolk. And a pinch of red powder. He set the bowl on the table. Yuna approached. She looked. She didn't know what ramen was. She had never seen a bowl with so many things in it at once. It wasn't like broth. It wasn't like a stir-fry. It was something else entirely. Something whole. Like a painting where every element is in its place. Dan pushed the bowl toward her. Try it. Yuna took the bowl, brought it to her face. Steam rose. The aroma hit her in waves. Meaty, mushroomy, spicy, salty, sour, all at once and all in harmony. She took a sip of broth. Her eyes widened. She picked up a clump of noodles with her chopsticks. The chopsticks were wooden. Dan had carved them from that very same red log. Yuna pulled the noodles into her mouth. The texture, the warmth, the taste. She chewed slowly. Then she put down the chopsticks. She looked at Dan. Her eyes were wet. She couldn't explain why. She had never eaten anything like this. No one in this world had ever eaten anything like this. Because in this world, no one had ever gathered so much care into a single bowl. Every ingredient had been prepared separately. Each one prepared, each in its place. This wasn't just food. It was a story. Broth simmered for 16 hours. Miso fermented for 2 weeks. Noodles kneaded by hand. Meat seared to the second. An egg boiled for exactly 3 minutes. All of this in one bowl. For one person. For her. Yuna finished eating. She set the empty bowl down, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, said quietly, "More." Dan smiled. He poured a second serving. Cott's Crossroads had received its main course. The next day, Dan made ramen for the line. 30 bowls. He couldn't make any more. The noodles took time. The flour needed grinding. But 30 bowls. The first 30 were for those standing at the front of the line. Goblins, lizard folk, 2 kobolds. They ate, they froze, they ate again. One of the lizard folk, after the last sip, looked at the empty bowl and hissed softly. Dan already knew that lizard folk hissing comes in different kinds. An angry hiss is sharp and loud, but this one was soft and long. That's how they expressed something for which they had no gesture and no word. Something closer to the word good, but deeper. By evening, the rumor about the noodles had spread farther than the rumor about the broth. The broth was a miracle. The noodles were a revolution. Because broth is a liquid, but noodles are texture and satiety and warmth and taste and fullness and something else. Something that makes you want to sit and be silent and not go anywhere. Dan stood at the threshold of Cat's Crossroads and looked at the road. 3 roads, 3 domains. Somewhere to the north, the Black Mountains and Lord Velgrim the Crimson. Somewhere to the southeast, a glow on the horizon and House Sharon. Somewhere to the west, a dark forest and something else the goblins don't like to talk about. And here, at the crossroads, a small stone house. A blue fire in the hearth. Rumors traveled faster than feet. Dan realized this in the 5th week, when the first unexpected visitors appeared at Cat's Crossroads. 3 of them, tall, in leather armor with insignia Dan had never seen before. Each had a short sword at their belt. Their eyes were cold and watchful. They didn't stand in line. They walked straight into the house. Yuna froze by the cauldron, spoon in hand. Pika hid behind a barrel. Dorg pressed all 4 hands to his chest. The eldest of the trio was a woman, tall, skin pale to the point of blueness, white hair, red pupils, a vampire. She surveyed the room with a single sweeping glance. The walls, the shelves, the pots, the hearth. Then she looked at Dan. He was standing at the workbench with a dagger in his hand. Not as a weapon. He had been cutting root vegetables when they entered. The vampire spoke. Her voice was even, emotionless. She said her name was Nessa Kor, that she was a mercenary, that she worked for a trade caravan from the Middle House, that the caravan was passing through the crossroads and had stopped for the night half a league to the north, and that the caravan master had heard from the goblins about a place where they could get food. She fell silent and looked at Dan. She waited. He put down the dagger, wiped his hands on the cloth at his belt, stepped closer to her, looked. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, not from fatigue, deeper. He'd seen such shadows in his father's regulars, in those who drank too much and ate too little. Hunger, a chronic, silent hunger that vampires carry within them like a curse. Dan pointed to the table. Sit down. She didn't sit down. The 2 behind her didn't move either. She said she'd pay. Dan shook his head. They don't pay with coins here. Here they pay with ingredients, or stories, or nothing. Depends on the day. She frowned. She hadn't heard of such a thing. Dan turned toward the hearth. He took out a pot of broth. He'd cooked this broth differently. 20 hours on the bones of a hellish boar. But in the last 2 hours, he'd added liver. Finely chopped liver from that same boar. It had dissolved almost completely into the broth. The result was a thick, dark stock, almost like demi-glace, but with a meaty aftertaste of liver. He poured a bowl and set it before the vampire. She looked at the broth, dark, thick, opaque. Steam rose slowly. She leaned in and sniffed. Her nostrils twitched. Her red pupils dilated. She took the bowl in both hands. Her hands were gloved. She removed the glove from her right hand. Her fingers were long, pale, with black nails. She gripped the bowl with her bare hand, brought it to her lips. The first sip. She closed her eyes. Dan watched. He knew this moment. He'd been waiting for it. The moment when the taste reaches that place inside that a human, or a non-human, hides deepest. The vampire drank, not quickly, not slowly, steadily, as if measuring out every sip, as if afraid the broth would run out and she'd be hungry again. She finished, opened her eyes, looked at the empty bowl, then at Dan. There was something in her eyes that Dan couldn't name. Not tears. Vampires don't cry ordinary tears. But something wet and reddish glinted in the corner of her left eye. She said one sentence. "I'm not hungry." Dan nodded. She repeated it, quieter. "I'm not hungry." As if she were saying it to herself, as if she were checking. Not hungry. For the first time, Dan understood. Broth made from bones and liver, iron, protein, collagen, fat, everything that's in blood. But without the blood, without the addiction, no hunting. No hunting. Without what makes vampires what they are in the eyes of others, monsters who drink the blood of others. This broth satisfied their hunger. It didn't completely replace blood, but it gave them what ordinary food didn't give vampires. Fullness, real fullness, not for an hour, not for 2, for a long time. Nessa Kor silently turned toward the exit. She stopped at the threshold. She didn't turn around. She said the caravan was leaving. She said she'd be back. She left. 2 mercenaries followed her. They never sat down. They never ate, but they saw their commander's face, and that was enough. Yuna approached Dan after they'd left. She quietly asked who they were. Dan replied, "Clients." That evening, when everyone had left and Dan and Yuna sat down to their usual dinner, she asked another float. She asked why the vampire was crying. Dan stirred the broth in his bowl. He thought. Then he said, "Imagine being hungry from birth. Not like you were hungry when I found you, but always, every day, every hour. A hunger that no food can satisfy. That can only be satisfied by one thing, by someone else's blood. And you know that drinking someone else's blood is wrong, but the hunger is stronger. And so you come to a place where they give you a bowl of soup. And after that soup, for the first time in your life, you're not hungry." Yuna was silent. Then she said quietly, "It's like being a half-breed. The hunger isn't in your stomach, but inside. When no one calls your name and you're hungry because of it. And then someone calls, and you're full." Dan looked at her. He nodded. Yes, that's exactly it. 2 days later, Nessa returned. Alone, without mercenaries, without armor, in simple, dark clothes. She walked in and sat down at the table in silence. Dan set a bowl in front of her, the same broth, liver broth, thick. She ate, silently. She left. The next day, again, and the next. The fourth time, she didn't come alone. Another vampire was with her, younger, thinner, with hungry, sunken eyes. Nesso said nothing. She just pointed to the table. The young one sat down. Dan brought 2 bowls. By the end of the 6th week, 4 vampires were coming to Cat's Crossroads, all from impoverished families, all with the same chronic hunger, all silent, all returning. The goblins watched the vampires warily, the lizard folk with caution, the kobolds hid. But the rule was the same for everyone. Whoever comes, eats. Whoever disagrees, doesn't eat. No one disagreed. Dan introduced another rule, weapons. He saw mercenaries from the caravans coming in with swords at their belts. He saw goblins clutching their cleavers. He saw lizard folk baring their teeth at each other. Sooner or later, someone would stab someone. He carved a stand out of mahogany. He placed it by the entrance, next to the door. Yuna carved 3 words on a stone above the stand. Iron. Here, please. The goblins obeyed immediately. They couldn't refuse the boss. The lizard men grumbled but sheathed their knives as well. The vampires laid down their swords without a word. The problem arose with the mercenary, a massive demon from the caravan, horns curving backward, a scar across his cheek. He looked at the counter, looked at Yuna, laughed, said he wouldn't put down his sword for a bowl of slop. Yuna opened her mouth to reply, but Dan was already standing beside her. He stepped out from behind the hearth. Calmly, without haste, he approached the mercenary. The mercenary was 2 heads taller than him, twice as broad-shouldered. He could kill Dan with a single blow. Dan looked up at him, silently, then turned to the counter, took his own dagger from it, Grurg's dagger, the only weapon he had, his only defense. He placed it on the bar. He turned back to the mercenary. He looked him in the eyes, calmly, not defiantly, just calmly. The mercenary looked at him, at the small, unarmed man who had just placed his only knife next to strangers' swords. 10 seconds of silence. The mercenary took his sword from his belt, placed it on the counter, sat down at the table. Dan returned to the kitchen. The rule took hold. From that day on, not a single weapon crossed the threshold. Cat's Crossroads became the first place in Gehenna where demons of different species and clans sat at the same table without weapons. Not because they trusted each other, but because they trusted the cook. By the end of the 2nd month, Dan had a 7-course menu. 3 kinds of broths: clear bone broth, mushroom miso, liver broth for vampires, ramen, braised meat with fermented root vegetables, sautéed mushrooms, and a new addition, Rice and egg. The simplest dish. Brown rice, a fried egg on top. Runny yolk. A pinch of red powder. A drop of beet oil. 3 sprigs of green-gray mint. This dish became the most popular. Not the most complicated, not the most impressive, but the most popular. Because it was simple and warm. And every time someone ate rice with egg, they felt something for which there was no word in the language of Gehenna. The word was home. Like home-cooked food. Like something a mother cooks in the morning. Only most demons didn't have mothers who cooked in the morning. Most had no concept of breakfast at all. There was hunting, there was hunger, there was satiety. And now there was a bowl of warm rice with egg, and they didn't understand why it made them want to sit quietly and not go anywhere. Dan understood. That was exactly what he was cooking. Not the rice, not the egg, but that feeling. Every evening after closing, Dan and Yuna had dinner together. It had become a ritual. Dan would cook something not on the menu, something experimental, or, on the contrary, something simple to the extreme. Yuna would set 2 bowls on the table. She would sit down, she would wait. Dan would bring the food. They would eat, sometimes in silence. Sometimes Yuna would talk about her day, about the goblin who'd come from the other end of the cave system and gotten lost 3 times on the way. About the lizard man who'd brought a live fish from the underground river as a gift. The fish was blind and glowed in the dark. Dan salted it. In a week, it would turn into something interesting. She arrived at the end of the 2nd month. Dan was in the kitchen. He was cooking the morning broth. Yuna was wiping down the table. Dorg was roasting bugs on 4 stones at once. Pika was slicing mushrooms. A typical morning. Then the door opened, and the air in the room changed. Dan felt it in his back. Not magic, not a threat. Something else. As if the temperature in the room had risen by 2 degrees. As if the torches had grown brighter. He turned around. A woman was standing in the doorway. Young, slender. Her face narrow and chiseled like a porcelain figurine. Amber eyes with vertical pupils. Hair red down to her waist. Her ears were pointed. Behind, her tail was moving from beneath her long cloak. Dan counted 8. Fluffy, red with white tips. They moved slowly and gracefully, as if each one lived a life of its own. She was dressed simply, not for her station. A traveling cloak, leather boots, no jewelry, no insignia. She had come incognito. Dan didn't know that yet. He saw a young kitsune in travel clothes, an unfamiliar customer. Yuna froze with a rag in her hand. Pika dropped the mushroom. Dorg stopped stirring the beetles, and all 4 hands hung limply at their sides. They knew. Dan didn't know. The kitsune surveyed the room, slowly, carefully. Shelves with pots, a hearth with a blue flame, a stone table, bowls, knives, sacks of grain, dried seaweed, a black cat on the windowsill. Her gaze settled on Dan. She looked at him for a long time, studying him. Dan held her gaze, not out of bravery, out of habit. 20 years in the kitchen, he was used to people looking at the cook. He pointed to the table. "Sit down." She sat down. Her movements were fluid, not a single superfluous gesture. Dan approached. He looked at her. The familiar assessment he performed on every visitor. Skin, eyes, hands, posture, breathing. She looked healthy, well-fed, well-groomed. She wasn't a starving vagrant, not a mercenary with an empty stomach. She was someone unaccustomed to hardship. But something was off. Dan saw it in the line of her shoulders. Too straight, too tense, like someone carrying something invisible and heavy. He asked, "What are you going to do?" She raised an eyebrow. A smirk touched the corner of her lips. She said she'd heard about this place, about a cook from another world, about food that makes demons cry. She'd come to check it out. Dan nodded. He asked 3 questions. How are you today? What have you been doing today? How are you feeling? She blinked. No one had ever asked her questions like that. Not in that order. Not with such simplicity. She answered briefly and evenly. Fine today. I was walking today. Nothing on my mind. Dan listened. Not to the words, to the intonation. Fine today meant not bad. I was walking today meant far and for a long time. Nothing on my mind meant so much that I don't know where to start. He nodded and went into the kitchen. He thought. Not hungry, not tired, not sick, but empty. It was a special kind of hunger, not of the body, something else. He'd seen people like that in Los Angeles. Rich, beautiful, with a perfect life on the outside, and with a hole inside that couldn't be filled with money, parties, or other people's admiration. He knew what to cook for people like that. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, nothing you could call mind-blowing. On the contrary, he took some brown rice, cooked it, cracked an egg onto a hot stone. The white sizzled, the yolk remained runny. He placed the fried egg on a mound of warm rice, added a pinch of salt, 3 sprigs of gray mint, a drop of beetle oil, and that was it. No meat, no mushrooms, no noodles. The simplest dish on his menu, rice and egg. He set the bowl in front of her. She looked at it, her eyebrows furrowed. That's all? Dan sat down across from her. He said, That's all. She looked at the rice, at the egg, at the 3 green leaves on top, at the drop of oil. The 8 tails behind her froze. She picked up her chopsticks, broke the yolk. Liquid gold flowed over the white rice, mixed with the greens, with the oil. She scooped up some rice and egg and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. Her expression didn't change. She swallowed, took another bite, and another, and another. She stopped halfway through the bowl. The chopsticks froze. She stared into the bowl. Dan waited. The silence lasted 10 seconds, 20, 30. Yuna behind the counter held her breath. Kitsune lifted her face. And Dan saw what he had been waiting for. Not tears, not shock, confusion. That genuine, deep confusion that comes when a person feels something they can't name. She asked quietly, Why? Dan didn't understand. She asked again, Why is that? A pause. She searched for words. So... She couldn't find the right word, because it didn't exist in her language. She wanted to say delicious, but in Gahanra, such a word didn't exist. She wanted to say that this simple rice and egg made her want to eat slowly, that she didn't want the bowl to run out, that she couldn't understand why 3 ingredients on a plate made her feel something in her throat and behind her eyes. She, who had eaten from silver trays in the halls of the southern house. She, who had tasted the blood of the rarest beasts and the livers of magical snakes, and everything considered the pinnacle of Gahanra cuisine. She sat in a stone house at the crossroads, with a bowl of gray rice, and couldn't swallow the lump in her throat. Dan said, Because this is for you. She looked at him. He continued, I didn't make this for a kitsune, not for a guest. Not for someone important. You came alone, in traveling clothes, without a name. I cooked this for a woman who walked a long way and has so much on her mind that she says nothing. A person like that doesn't need dragon's blood on a golden platter. Someone like that needs rice and an egg. And for someone to sit across from her and not ask unnecessary questions. She was silent. Then she lowered her eyes to the bowl. She finished eating, slowly. Every grain of rice, every piece of egg. She licked her chopsticks. She set the bowl down. She looked at Dan. She said, I'll be back." He nodded. She stood up. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned around. She said her name. Saren. She left. Yuna ran up to Dan as soon as the door closed. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. She grabbed his sleeve and whispered quickly and passionately. Dan listened. The name Saren meant nothing to him, but from Yuna's and the assistant's reactions, he realized he had just fed rice and eggs to someone before whom the entire southern domain bowed their heads. The heiress, 8 Tails, the daughter of Sharon the Nine-Tailed, one of the most powerful young demonesses on the continent. And she was sitting at his stone table and eating gray rice, and couldn't explain to herself why she felt like crying. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he returned to the hearth and continued cooking the broth. Yuna stared at him, her mouth agape. She asked, "You don't care who she is?" Dan didn't turn around. He replied, "I do care. I care who she is to others. To me, she's a customer who came in hungry. Not in her stomach. Deeper. I fed her. That's my job." Saren returned 3 days later, alone again, back in her travel clothes. Dan didn't ask the 3 questions. He already knew. He cooked rice with an egg, but this time he added a small mound of fermented fruit on the side, sour and crunchy, a contrast to the soft rice. She tasted it, winced at the sourness. Then she tried again, and again. The sourness opened up. It became not hostile, but interesting. Saren looked up. For the first time, something other than her usual mask flashed in her eyes. Curiosity. She asked what it was. Dan explained. Fermentation, time and salt and bacteria. A simple root vegetable becomes something new. She didn't understand half the words, but she got the gist. A simple thing can become something else, if you give it time. On her 5th visit, she stayed after closing time. Yuna had already gone to sleep on the cot Dan had made for her in the back room. Pika and Dorg had gone into the caves. Dan was washing the bowls. Saren sat at the table and watched him work, silently. He finished washing, wiped his hands, sat down across from her. She spoke. Not right away, slowly, as if every word came with difficulty. She told him that since she was 3, they had been preparing her, not food, her, as a political tool. Every meal was a ritual. Every dish meant something. Status, alliance, threat. She couldn't remember a single time when she'd eaten simply because she was hungry, simply because she wanted to. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he asked one thing. "What would you eat if no one were watching?" "Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, something you want, just for you." Saren opened her mouth, closed it, remained silent. 10 minutes. Dan didn't rush her. He sat and waited. She finally said quietly, "I don't know." Her voice wavered. She didn't know. 24 years of life, thousands of dishes, and she didn't know what she liked, because no one had ever asked. Dan stood up. He went to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, he returned with a plate. Rice, scrambled eggs, green onions, not gray mint, but specifically onions. He'd found them last week, wild onions growing by the river, thin green feathers with a sharp, clean scent. He chopped them finely and sprinkled them over the scrambled eggs. He set the plate in front of her. She looked at it. She picked up the chopsticks. She ate with her hands. The chopsticks slipped, and she scooped up the rice with her fingers and popped it into her mouth. And she laughed, quietly, with her mouth closed, because her mouth was full of rice. The laughter turned into something else. She ate and laughed, and tears streamed from her amber eyes. Not from grief, from something opposite. From the fact that for the first time in her life, she was eating with her hands, like a child, like no one else, like herself. The cart with Southern groceries changed everything. Dan stood in the kitchen and looked at what was laid out before him. Real butter, golden, thick, with a scent he remembered. Not butter in the earthly sense, but close, very close. White flour, finely ground. Not gray grains that need to be crushed with a stone for hours. Ready-made flour. Eggs, large, with burgundy shells. The yolk inside was orange like a sunset. Meat. Not the tough game of hellish boars. Livestock meat. Tender, pink, with a thin marbled layer of fat. And spices. Pouches of powders and seeds and dried leaves. Dan opened each one, sniffed, tasted a bit on the tip of his tongue. One powder was black and fiery. Pepper. Not black pepper, but something with the same effect. A burning sensation on the tongue, warmth in the throat. The second was reddish with a smoky aroma. Paprika, or its local equivalent. The third was yellow and earthy. Turmeric. The fourth was brown and slightly sweet. Cinnamon. The fifth had a sharp floral scent, something between cardamom and cloves. Dan arranged everything on the shelves, each jar in its place, each bag marked with a notch in the clay. He stood in the middle of his kitchen, and his head was spinning. Not from fatigue, from the possibilities. Over the past 2 months, he'd worked with a dozen ingredients. Now he had 50. He could make anything. Well, almost anything. The first thing he made, noodles. New noodles, made from white flour. He kneaded the dough. Flour and water and a pinch of salt and 1 egg. He kneaded it for 20 minutes. The dough became smooth and elastic. He let it rest for half an hour. Then he rolled it out. Thin. Thinner than with gray flour. He cut long, even strips. He picked up one. It stretched without tearing. Elastic. Dense. Perfect for ramen. He tossed a handful into the boiling miso broth. 3 minutes. He pulled them out. The noodles were yellow from the egg. Springy. Slippery. He placed a serving in a bowl of broth. On top, thin slices of fresh meat fried in oil with black pepper powder. Fermented root vegetables, green onions, half an egg, seaweed, and a drop of oil. He looked at the bowl. It was ramen. Real ramen. Not an approximation. Not a compromise. Ramen. Miso ramen with black pepper and tender meat. In another world, on the other side of reality. He took a bite, closed his eyes. Broth, noodles, meat. Everything was just right. Everything was right. He took a sip and swallowed, then took another, and stood with the bowl in his hands in a stone house at the crossroads of 3 roads, eating ramen. And he was 28 years old. And he was dead and alive, in hell and at home at the same time. Because if you can eat ramen, it means you're home somewhere. Yuna stood nearby and watched. He held out the bowl to her. She tasted it. She looked up. It's different. It's not the ramen it used to be. It's something. She didn't finish her sentence. She ate. From that day on, the menu at Cat's Crossroads split. There were the old dishes, made from local ingredients. For those who paid with what they found in the caves and on the plains, broths, stir-fries, rice made from gray grains. And there were new dishes, made from ingredients from the south, for those who could bring something more valuable, or for those whom Dan simply wanted to give them to. He didn't make a system out of it, didn't set prices, didn't draw up a menu. He just knew who needed what. Grurg still got his strong bone broth. The old goblin didn't want anything else. It was his soup, his discovery, his connection to the chef. The lizard folk liked the stew, hot, quick, and bright, with a crunch and heat and red powder. The kobolds preferred rice. The quiet little creatures would sit in a corner and eat their rice and eggs and be silent and happy. The vampires got liver broth, thick and dark and life-saving. And for those who came for the first time and didn't know what they wanted, Dan cooked whatever he thought was best. And he was never wrong. On the third day after receiving the new supplies, a woman burst into Cat's Crossroads. The door flew open with a bang. Everyone jumped. Yuna dropped her bowl. The woman stood in the doorway, tall, a head taller than Dan, broad-shouldered. Her left forearm was wrapped in a rag, blood seeping through the rag, dark, thick. Her face was hard, high cheekbones, a broken nose, a scar running from her right temple to her chin. Her skin was gray with a bluish tinge. Horns. 2 short horns on her forehead, curving upward. Anicoborn, a warrior. A 2-handed sword in a worn scabbard at her back. She stood there, swaying. Her eyes were clouded with pain and exhaustion. She looked at Dan, then at the hearth, then at the bowls on the shelf. She opened her mouth. She said one word. Eat. And she collapsed to one knee. Dan was there a second later. He caught her, heavy. There were more muscles under her skin than in any person he had ever touched. Yuna ran up from the other side. Together they carried her to the cot in the back room. They laid her down. Dan looked at the bandage. The wound was deep, ragged. Something with claws or teeth, not a blade. He rinsed it with water, bandaged it with a clean cloth. Yuna brought some herbs. Dan didn't know which ones were medicinal and which weren't. Yuna knew. She ground 3 leaves into a paste and applied it to the wound. The woman hissed in pain. Then she went limp, fell asleep, or lost consciousness. Dan went to the kitchen. The wounded woman needed food. Nothing heavy, something restorative. He made broth, clear bone broth, made from fresh meat, tender. He added a pinch of yellow powder, turmeric, an anti-inflammatory in his world. Maybe it works here too. He added finely chopped green onions, 1 egg beaten into the hot broth, thin strands of egg white in the golden liquid. He brought the bowl to the cot. The woman woke up to the smell. She opened her eyes, gray, heavy. She looked at the bowl, at Dan. He lifted her head, brought the bowl to her. She drank, slowly, sip by sip. The broth was warm and light and soothing. She finished it, closed her eyes, fell asleep. This time she really fell asleep. Dan covered her with a fur. He returned to the kitchen. Yuna was standing by the hearth, watching him. She asked who she was. Dan shrugged. I don't know. Yuna said, an Oniko-born, a northern guard by her armor. But there are no crests on the armor. They've been erased. On purpose. A deserter. Dan nodded. A wounded deserter. Hungry. At his door. The 3rd in 2 months. First Yuna, now this one. Cat's Crossroads drew people in like a bonfire draws moths in the dark. The woman woke up toward evening. She came out of the back room. She was limping but held herself upright. Dan was standing by the hearth, cooking dinner. She approached. She stood beside him, silently. He didn't turn around. He kept working. She watched his hands, how he chopped, how he stirred, how he checked the broth's temperature with his finger. She stood there for about 5 minutes. Then she said, Kaede. He turned around. She repeated it. My name is Kaede, Norn. He nodded. Dan. She nodded back. Then she asked, Can I stay? Dan looked at her height, at her shoulders, at the scar, at the 2-handed sword on her back, at the eyes that held a weariness deeper than that of a wound or a journey. A weariness that had built up over the years. He said, Weapon on the rack. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she took off her sword, carried it to the rack, put it down, came back. He placed a bowl of ramen in front of her. Fresh ramen. White noodles with tender meat and miso broth. She sat down. She picked up the chopsticks. Her hands were shaking, not from weakness. She was a warrior. A warrior's hands don't shake from weakness. They shake for another reason. She ate. For a long time. Not because there was a lot, but because after every bite she paused, as if she needed time to process what was happening. She finished eating. She set the bowl down. She looked at Dan. She didn't say thank you. She didn't bow. She didn't cry. She said, "I'll stand by the door. No one will enter here with a weapon while I'm here." Dan looked at her, at the scar, at the broken nose, at the heavy gray eyes. He nodded. From morning on, Kaede stood at the door of the Kota crossroads. 2 meters tall, broad shoulders, arms crossed over her chest, a stony face. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there. And everyone who entered handed over their weapons without a word. Because arguing with a 6-foot-tall Oniko-born warrior over a katana is a whole different kind of madness. In the evening, after closing, Dan prepared dinner for everyone. 3 bowls on the table. His, Yuna's, Kaede's. Yuna chattered. She told them about the lizard man who'd come today with a whole basket of glowing fish. Kaede was silent. She ate. Dan listened to Yuna and watched Kaede. The warrior ate neatly. The chopsticks in her enormous hands looked like toothpicks, but she held them correctly, and she ate slowly. And when Yuna laughed at something she herself had said, the corner of Kaede's mouth twitched for a second. For just a second. Dan noticed. The next morning, he got up before everyone else. He gathered a box made of redwood bark. He put rice with meat and mushrooms, an egg, and slices of fermented root vegetables. He put the lid on. He set it on the table. When Kaede came out of the pantry, he nodded toward the box. "This is for you, for the road." She looked at it. "You're going on patrol. I saw how you were looking at the road." The 3rd month began with trouble. Dan found out about it from Kaede. She had returned from patrol earlier than usual. She went into the house. Her face was stern. Her eyes were colder than usual. She said there was a detachment on the northern road. 12 warriors in heavy armor bearing the crest of House Velgrim. A horned skull on a red background. They had set up camp a league from the crossroads and weren't moving. They were waiting. Dan listened. Yuna turned pale. Pika cowered in a corner. Even Dorg stopped moving his 4 arms. House Velgrim, the North. Lord Velgrim the Crimson, one of the 7. Dan knew about him from Yuna. She used to tell him stories in the evenings. Lord Velgrim rules the northern mountains. His domain consists of mines, forges, and an army. The Onikoborni form his guard. Kaede is his former subject. He is cruel and straightforward, and believes that strength is the only argument. Dan asked Kaede, "They're after you." She shook her head. "No, they wouldn't send 12 plate-armored soldiers for me. They would send a single assassin. It's a delegation." Dan nodded. A delegation to him. The rumors had reached the Lord of the North. The next morning, they arrived. Not all 12, 3. The commander and 2 escorts. The commander was an Oniko-born, shorter than Kaede, but broader, a face like a block of stone, 4 horns, dark steel armor, a crest on his chest. He entered the house. He looked at the weapons rack. He looked at Kaede, who was standing by the door with her arms. Their eyes met. Something flashed between them. Recognition, hatred, or something more complex. The commander drew his sword. He placed it on the rack. The 2 behind him did the same. He sat down at the table. He looked at Dan. He spoke. His voice was low and steady as a rockfall. He said that Lord Velgrim the Crimson had heard of the cook. that the cook from another world prepared food from that makes demons weep, that Lord Velgrim was offering the cook a place at court, personal chef to the Lord of the North, a salary, protection, status, whatever the cook desires. In return, the cook would travel to the northern capital and cook exclusively for House Velgrim. Dan listened. Yuna translated what he didn't understand. When the commander finished, Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "And if I refuse?" The commander's expression didn't change. He said that Lord Velgrim hoped for a reasonable answer, that a refusal would be taken as disrespect, that the consequences of disrespecting the Lord of the North were well known to all. Dan nodded. He stood up. He went to the kitchen. He returned 10 minutes later with 3 bowls. He set them down in front of the commander and his men. Ramen, miso broth, white noodles, meat stir-fried with black pepper, egg, seaweed, onion. The commander looked at the bowl, at Dan, at the bowl. He picked up his chopsticks. He ate in silence. His face was stony, not a single emotion. But Dan wasn't looking at his face. He was looking at his hands, the commander's hands, which gripped the chopsticks tighter with every bite. His fingers had turned white from the tension. He ate and clenched the chopsticks like a weapon, because his body knew no other way to cope with what was happening inside. He finished eating. He put down the chopsticks. 2 of his men had already finished. One of them sat with his eyes closed. The others stared at an empty bowl and didn't move. The commander looked at Dan. Dan sat down across from him. He said, "Tell your lord, I won't go to the northern capital. Koda's crossroads stands here, at the crossroads, because this is a place for everyone, not for just one house. If Lord Velgrim wants to eat my ramen, he can come here, just like anyone else. Leave his weapons at the door, sit down at the table, and eat." The commander was silent. 10 seconds. 20. Then he stood up, took his weapon from the rack, left. Turned around at the threshold, looked at Dan, said, "I'll pass it on." Then, more quietly, "The broth is good." He left. Kaede approached Dan after they had left. Her face was tense. She said he had just refused Lord Velgrim, that this could mean war, that the 12 plate-armored soldiers in the League at the crossroads were not an embassy, but a vanguard, that if Velgrim decided to take Dan by force, 30 goblins and 1 Onicoborn wouldn't stop him. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he said, "I know." She looked at him, waiting for him to continue. He shrugged. "I'm a cook, not a diplomat, not a warrior. If he sends an army, I won't be able to do anything. But if I leave with them, Cat's Crossroads will close. Yuna will be left alone. You'll be left alone. The goblins will be left without food. 150 creatures who come every day will go hungry. I can't." Kaede looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said, "I'll double the patrols." She left. A week passed. The Lathniks didn't attack. They left on the 4th day. Dan didn't know why. Kaede suspected that the commander had conveyed to Velgrim not only a refusal, but also the taste of ramen. And Velgrim was thinking. What exactly he was thinking remained a mystery. But there was a respite, and Dan used it. 3 days after the armored warriors left, Lily came to the crossroads of Koda. She didn't look like the other visitors. Small, thin, pale skin but human. No horns, no fangs, no tails. A human. The first human besides Dan that he had seen in this world. She was wearing gray clothes, simple and coarse. A brown scar on her neck, a mark from a rope or a chain, calluses on her hands. Not from work, but from handcuffs. She stood at the threshold and looked inside. Her eyes were gray, behind round glasses made of thin wire. The lenses were cracked. Yuna approached. She asked, "Do you want to eat?" The girl flinched. She looked at Yuna, at her horns. She turned pale. She took a step back. Yuna understood. She stepped away. She called for Dan. He came out from behind the hearth. He looked at the girl, a human, young, frightened, with marks from shackles on her hands. Dan pointed at himself, spoke in the common tongue. A human, like you. She looked at him, didn't believe him. He repeated, a human from another world. She swallowed, spoke in the common tongue, clearly, without an accent. Lily. My name is Lily Corvin. Dan nodded. Come in, Lily. She entered, slowly, every step like walking through a minefield. Yuna stayed to the side. Kaede stepped away from the door. Pika and Dorg hid in the kitchen. Everyone understood. This girl was afraid of demons. All demons. Terrified. Dan sat her down at the table, the one farthest from the door, with her back to the wall, so she could see the whole room, so she would feel safe. He went to the kitchen, he thought. A human. She'd been running from someone. Marks of shackles, gray clothes, an order. Yuna had said there were people who came to Gehenna through the rifts, hunters of the light, fanatics. They exterminate demons. This girl was one of them, or had been. The marks on her hands said she hadn't left of her own free will. What did she need? Dan wondered. She wasn't hungry. Well, not very. Scared, lonely. In a strange world, among those she'd been taught to hate. She needed something familiar, something from her old life. He didn't know what her old life had been like, but he knew one thing. If the Hunters of Light were a human sect, that meant Lily had grown up among humans. That meant somewhere in her memory there was human food. Simple, peasant food. The kind her mother used to cook before the world turned cruel. Dan fried an egg. A simple egg. On one side, the white was set, the yolk runny. He placed it on a slice of gray bread. He'd learned to bake bread in the second week after getting white flour. Simple, unleavened, dense, but bread. A pinch of salt on top, and that was it. An egg on toast. He set it in front of Lily. She looked. At the toast, at the egg, at the runny yolk, and something happened to her face. Something Dan saw once a month, maybe less often. The moment when food goes not into the stomach, but into the memory. When the taste isn't yet on the tongue, but already in the eyes. When you see a dish and you know with your whole body. Lily didn't eat. She looked at the toast. Her hands lay on the table, her glasses fogged up. She took them off, wiped them with her sleeve, put them back on, looked again. An egg on toast, a yellow yolk, white egg white, gray bread, grains of salt. She picked up the toast with her hands, took a bite. The yolk ran down her fingers. Lily stayed, like Yuna, like Kaede. The Koto intersection drew people in. On the third day, Lily came out of the back room where she'd been sleeping on a cot next to Yuna and quietly asked if she could help with anything. Dan looked at her hands, slender, not the hands of a warrior, not the hands of a cook, the hands of a person who wrote a lot. Calluses on her fingers from a pen. He asked, "Can you count?" She nodded. "Read and write." He led her to the shelves, pointed to the pots, to the sacks, to the supplies. There's no order here. I don't know how much of what we have, how much we spend each day, how much we need to order. I keep it all in my head, but my head has its limits. I need someone to keep track of things. Lily looked at the shelves, then at Dan. For the first time, something other than fear flashed in her eyes. Interest. She asked for something to write with. Dan gave her flat stones and a dagger for scratching. 2 days later, she returned to him with a stone slab on which neat columns had been scratched. Supplies, consumption, forecast. She had calculated everything. Every sack of grain, every pot of yeast, every jug of oil. They had enough flour for 12 days at the current rate of consumption. Meat for 8, eggs for 5, spices for 3 weeks. Regular supplies are needed. Dan watched her work. Straight lines, precise numbers, neat, small handwriting, even when writing with a dagger on stone. He smiled. "Welcome, you're an accountant." Lily didn't understand the word accountant, but she got the gist. She nodded. And for the first time since arriving at Cat's Crossroads, she smiled ever so slightly. Lily and Yuna had said it more than once at first talk. Yuna tried. She talked to everyone, all the time, but Lily froze every time Yuna came close. Horns. Lily saw the horns and something inside her tightened. 10 years in the Order. 10 years of being taught that anything with horns and tails and fangs is the enemy. It is evil. It is a fiend that must be destroyed. Yuna could feel it. She didn't say anything, but she could feel it. Dan saw it. He didn't intervene directly. Instead, he did something else. Every morning, he prepared 3 servings of breakfast, 3 identical bowls of rice and eggs. He set them on the table, 3 seats. Yuna sat down first. Lily came in later. She sat across from her. They ate in silence. Every day, the same food, at the same table. On the 3rd day, Yuna moved the salt shaker toward Lily, without a word. On the 5th day, Lily pushed the plate of green onions toward Yuna, without a word. On the 7th day, Yuna laughed at something. Lily flinched, but she didn't pull away. On the 10th day, Yuna was telling a story about a lizard man and his glowing fish. Lily listened, and quietly asked what color the fish was. Yuna lit up and began to describe it. Blue, with silver stripes, and blind, with huge empty eyes. Lily grimaced. Yuna laughed. Lily smiled slightly. It was slow, painfully slow, but it was working. Because you can't hate a creature you eat rice and eggs with every morning. Dan knew that. His father knew that. His grandmother knew that. The table is a place where people stop being enemies. Not all at once. Not all at once. But inevitably. Lily took charge of the shopping. She compiled a list of suppliers. The goblins of Grurg. Bones and meat and bugs and mushrooms and seaweed and root vegetables. Lizard folk. Fish from underground rivers and eggs of unknown creatures and salt from mountain outcrops. Kobolds. Grains and wild onions and honey. Caravanners from the middle houses. Spices and oil and flour and cloth and utensils. And once every 2 weeks, a nameless wagon from the south. The best produce. No note after the first time. Just a wagon. Just supplies. Serene. Lily organized everything. She drew up a delivery schedule. She calculated a buffer stock in case of disruptions. She suggested drying surplus meat for the winter. She suggested smoking fish. Dan listened and nodded and was amazed every time. The girl from the fanatical order could calculate faster than any accountant he knew in Los Angeles. One evening, Lily lingered in the kitchen. Everyone had left. Dan was washing the pot. She sat at the table, scribbling numbers on a stone. Then she stopped. She looked up. She asked quietly, "You're not afraid of me?" Dan turned around. He looked at her. A thin, pale girl in cracked glasses, with calluses from handcuffs on her wrists. He asked, "What is there to be afraid of?" She replied, "I was a hunter. I killed demons. I was taught to kill. For 5 years, I believed they were all enemies. That Yuna was an enemy. That Kaede was an enemy. That Grurg was an enemy. I was the one they feared at night." Dan was silent. Then he said, "You were. And now you're sitting in my kitchen counting bags of flour." She lowered her eyes. She said quietly, "I saw my mentor torture a demon child, a boy. He was maybe 10 years old. His horns had just started to grow. My mentor said he was purifying him, that he was drawing out the filth. The boy was screaming. I stood there and watched. My whole order stood there and watched. No one moved. I didn't move either. Dan didn't interrupt. She continued, quieter. Then at night, I went into the cell. The boy wasn't screaming anymore. He was lying there, trembling. I opened the door, let him out. They caught me 2 days later. The mentor wanted to purify me too, but I ran away, through the rift, back to Gehenru, to those we were taught to hate. She fell silent. Her hands were shaking. Dan came over. He sat down next to her, not across from her, next to her. He was silent for a moment. Then he stood up. He went to the kitchen. He returned 5 minutes later. Toast, an egg, a pinch of salt. He set it down in front of her. She looked at the toast. She looked at Dan. He said, "You saved that child. You did the right thing. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Now eat." Morning. Lily ate her toast and cried quietly and carefully, like someone who was used to crying so that no one would hear. Dan sat next to her and said nothing. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say everything would be okay. He just sat there. The 4th month began with Kaede bringing news. She had returned from the Southern Patrol. Her face was grim. She said she'd seen a camp to the west. Not demons, people, with white cloaks and the symbol of the broken sun on their shields. Hunters of the light. 10, maybe 15, 2 days' journey from the crossroads. Lily turned pale. Dan looked at her, then at Kaede, then at Yuna, who was standing by the hearth, clutching a spoon with pale fingers. He asked Kaede, "Are they coming here?" She shook her head. "Not yet. They're camped out, scouting the area. But if they find out there's a man here who feeds the demons." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Dan nodded. That evening, he prepared dinner for everyone. 4 bowls on the table. Yuna, Kaede, Lily, him. They ate in silence. No one talked about their day. The silence was heavy. Dan finished eating. He set down his bowl. He looked at his people. The 3 women sitting at his table. Yuna, 19 years old, a half-breed, who had been driven out from everywhere. Kaede, 26, a warrior, who had deserted so she wouldn't have to kill children. Lily, 20, a former hunter, who freed a demonic child and lost everything. 3 women, 3 kinds of pain, 3 reasons to be here. And him, 28, a cook, who died in a 24-hour shop in Los while protecting Aunt Han, and now he cooks broth in another world. He said, "The hunters will come, sooner or later. The lords will come too. Someone is bound to come." Mira Van Ter appeared at the Cat's Crossroads by accident. She got lost. For 3 days, she wandered the roads of Gehenna without a map or a destination. The youngest daughter of an impoverished vampire house, banished from the ancestral castle after her older brothers gambled away the family fortune in a trade war with House Sharon. They gave her a bag of clothes and told her not to return. She was 31 years old. She looked 17. Vampire metabolism, capricious, sharp-tongued, hungry. Hungry in the way that only poor vampires are hungry. A constant itch under her skin, a constant burning in her throat, a constant hunger that no ordinary food can satisfy. Because vampires need blood, and good blood costs money. And Mira had no money. She was walking down the west road when she saw a stone house and a line in front of it, and the smell. The smell hit her from 50 paces away. She stopped. She drew in a breath. Her nostrils quivered. There was something about that smell. Something warm and thick and rich. Something that made the burning in her throat quiet down for a second. She walked over. She stood at the end of the line. The goblins in front of her glanced at her. The lizard man behind her snorted. A vampire in line at a goblin diner. Not a sight you see every day. Mira straightened her back, lifted her chin, put on the face she'd practiced to perfection over 30 years. The face that says, "I'm above you, everyone, even when I'm standing in line, especially when I'm standing in line." She waited her turn. She went inside. She looked around. Stone walls, shelves lined with pots, a hearth with a blue flame, the smell of broth and roasted meat, and something sour and spicy. Kaede by the door, Yuna behind the counter, a black cat on the windowsill, and a man by the hearth, small by demonic standards, No horns, no fangs, no tail. Just a man with a knife in his hand and a towel slung over his shoulder. Mira sat down at the table. Yuna approached, asked what she wanted. Mira looked down at her, saw the horns. Half-breed. Mira grimaced, said, "Anything. I don't care." Yuna wasn't offended. She was used to it. She went over to Dan, whispered to him, "A vampire. Hungry. Angry." Dan looked at Mira across the room. He saw pale skin, sunken eyes, dark circles, dry lips, trembling fingers. Chronic vampire hunger, like Nessa Core's, but worse. Nessa was a mercenary with an income and could afford at least cheap blood. This girl hadn't eaten properly in a long time. He poured some liver broth. That very one, thick, dark, made from the bones and liver of a hellish boar. 20-hour, with iron and collagen and fat and protein. Everything that's in blood, but without the blood. He set it in front of Mira. She looked at the bowl, at the dark, opaque liquid. She sniffed it. Her eyes widened. Her pupils became vertical slits. Her hands stopped shaking. She took the bowl, brought it to her lips. She drank, not in sips, in a stream, like a person who had been running through the desert and finally found water. She drank and drank and drank, and the broth ran down her chin, and she didn't wipe it off because she didn't care. She finished it, set the bowl down, froze, sat motionless for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then she slowly straightened up. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. She ran her tongue over her lips. They weren't dry. She put her hand to her throat. It didn't burn. She looked up at Dan. He was standing by the hearth, watching her, calmly, without expecting gratitude, without showing off. He just stood there, waiting for a reaction, like a chef waiting for a customer to taste the food. Mira stood up. She walked over to him. She stopped a step away. She was shorter than him, thin, small, with sunken eyes, dry hair, and pale skin. She said, "I'm not hungry." Dan nodded. She repeated, louder, "I'm not hungry. Do you understand? 31 years. For 31 years, I've been hungry every day, every hour, every minute. So hungry I want to bite the walls. So hungry I can't sleep. So hungry I think only of blood, only of it, always. And now. Not now. There's nothing. Quiet. It's quiet inside. You did this. With your soup." She choked. Dan was silent. She turned around. She walked to the door. She turned at the threshold. Her face was angry. Her voice was angry. She said, "I'll be back tomorrow, and you'll pour me some more. Got it? This isn't a request." She left, slammed the door. Yuna raised an eyebrow. Kaede snorted. Lily adjusted her glasses. Dan returned to the hearth. Peace returned. Every day she came, sat down at the table, received a bowl of liver broth, drank, left. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say hello. She didn't say goodbye. On the 4th day, she came in and sat down, and when Yuna brought the bowl, Mira looked at her and said, "Are you always this cheerful, or are you pretending?" Yuna blinked. Then she smiled. She said, "I'm not pretending. I like it here." Mira snorted. "You like carrying bowls around." Yuna shrugged. "I like that people smile after getting these bowls." Mira silently took the bowl and drank without looking at Yuna, but the next day she said, "I need a job." Yuna was at a loss. She called for Dan. He came out. He looked at Mira. She was standing in front of him, chin up, shoulders straight. Her face was haughty. But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes said, "I have nowhere else to go. I can't just come here and drink free soup every day. I need to do something, because if I don't do something useful, I'll go crazy being tied to this place, to you, to your damn broth." Dan thought. He looked at her hands, small, slender, but with long, nimble fingers. He asked, "What can you do?" She replied, "Nothing useful. I'm educated. I know the etiquette of the 5 houses. I know the history of the bloodlines. I know reception protocols and seating arrangements and 1,000 meaningless things that only aristocrats need." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Seating?" She nodded. He smirked. "You'll be the maitre d'." She didn't know that word. He explained. "You'll decide who sits where, who sits next to who sits far from whom." Mira blinked. Then she understood. At the cat's crossroads, creatures who were sworn enemies outside sat at the same table every day. Goblins and lizards, vampires and kobolds, mercenaries from different houses. Seating 2 members of warring clans next to each other means a fight. Seating them too far apart means failing to solve the problem. You need someone who knows who hates whom, who's related to whom by blood, who had taken whose territory 3 generations ago. Mira knew. She was an aristocrat. She had grown up with this knowledge. And for the first time in her life, this knowledge was useful. She nodded. "I agree." From that day on, Mira stood at the entrance next to Kaede. Kaede kept an eye on the weapons. Mira watched the seating arrangements. A goblin from the Groga clan enters. Mira points to a spot by the wall. A lizard man from the River clan enters. Mira points to the opposite end. 2 mercenaries from the Middle House caravan enter. Mira looks at their insignia. She mentally calculates. These are from the House of Thorn. Those lizard men have by a trade agreement with House Sharon. Conflict is unlikely. They can be seated closer. It worked. Mira was sharp and domineering and cantankerous, and she said things that made Yuna blush and Kaede clench her fists. But she was a brilliant maitre d'. Not a single conflict in the dining room all week. Not a single sidelong glance that escalated into a growl. Not a single incident, because Mira Van Ter knew exactly where to seat everyone so that tension remained below the threshold. Dinner was now for 5. Dan, Yuna, Kaede, Lily, Mira. 5 bowls on the long table. Yuna chattered. Kaede was silent. Lily quietly wrote something on a stone. Mira criticized everything. The broth was too hot. The rice was too gray. The meat was too tough. Yuna was too loud. Kaede was too quiet. Lily was too pale. Dan was too calm. She criticized and ate and ate. And every evening after dinner, she would go to her corner and sit quietly, wrapping her arms around her knees. And Dan knew she sat that way because she felt good. Because her hunger was silent. Because she was warm. Because she had a table and people at that table. Because for the first time in 31 years, she had a place. Hana Chong appeared just like that. Lily had gone to the kobolds to pick up a delivery. The road ran through the western forest. Usually Dorg went with her, but that day the 4-armed goblin had a stomachache and stayed behind. Lily went alone. Kaede was on the northern patrol. Dan didn't find out that Lily had gone alone until an hour later. When he found out, he pressed his lips together and said nothing. But Yuna saw how knuckles on the knife's handle turn white. The western forest was dangerous. Not the forest itself, what lived in it. Lily walked along the path, a basket on her back, glasses on her nose. It was dark in the forest, even during the day. The trees stood close together. Their trunks were black and thick. The canopies closed in overhead and let no light through. Soft soil beneath her feet. Silence. Too much silence. Lily stopped. Something was wrong. She listened. Nothing. No birds, no rustling, no wind. The kind of silence that comes when all living things have hidden themselves. Lily ran. Too late. They emerged from behind the trees. 3 of them, white cloaks, the symbol of the shattered sun, light armor, swords, hunters of the light, a reconnaissance squad. Lily froze. The blood drained from her face. Her legs wouldn't move. She knew these people, not personally, but she knew the uniform and knew the symbol and knew what the broken sun meant. Purification, fire, pain. The eldest of the 3 looked at her, young, about 25 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, a handsome, regular face. He recognized her clothes, recognized her glasses. Novices of the order wore those. He said her name, Lily Corvin, a fugitive, a heretic, a traitor to the faith. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Lily closed her eyes. And then a woman stepped out from behind a tree, short, stocky, dark hair tied in a bun, an Asian face with deep shadows under her eyes, a worn leather jacket on her shoulders, nothing in her hands. She stood between Lily and the hunters, calmly, as if she'd just stepped out for a walk. The senior hunter looked at her. He frowned. A human, unarmed, without armor, in the demonic forest. He told her to step aside. She didn't move. She spoke, in the hunter's language, fluently, no accent. She said that this girl was under her protection, that if they wanted to take the girl, they would have to get past her. The elder laughed. Past you, unarmed. The woman smiled, raised her hand, snapped her fingers. The ground beneath the hunter's feet flared, not with fire, with light, a green glowing light. Tree roots stirred. They rose from the soil. They wrapped themselves around the hunter's legs, tightly, quickly. Within 3 seconds, all 3 were knee-deep in living roots and couldn't move. The elder lunged. The roots tightened. He drew his sword. He slashed at a root. The blade bounced off. The roots were hard as stone. The woman stood and watched, calmly. Then she said, I won't kill you. Leave. Forget this path. Forget this girl. If you return, the forest won't let you out. The roots released them. The hunters exchanged glances. The eldest looked at the woman with a long, heavy gaze. Then he turned. He left. The other 2 followed him. When they were out of sight, the woman turned to Lily. She was standing with her back pressed against a tree, white as a sheet. Her legs wouldn't hold her. The woman crouched down beside her. She said quietly, It's over. They're gone. Breathe. Lily breathed, with difficulty. The woman took something wrapped in cloth out of her pocket, unwrapped it, a piece of dried root. She gave it to Lily. Chew it. It'll calm you down. Lily chewed. It was bitter, but her breathing evened out. The woman helped her stand up. She asked where she was going. Lily pointed to the path, to the kobolds, for a delivery, for Cat's Crossroads. The woman froze. She repeated, Cat's Crossroads? Lily nodded. The woman was silent for a minute. Then she asked, quietly, Who's cooking there? Lily said. Dan, a man, from another world, a cook. The woman closed her eyes. She stood like that for a few seconds. Then she opened them. She said, Take me there. They walked for an hour, Lily in front, the woman behind her, in silence. Lily tried to ask who she was. The woman didn't answer. She walked and remained silent. When they emerged from the forest and Lily saw a stone house at the crossroads, she ran. She burst through the door, gasping for breath. Yuna caught her. Kaede, who had already returned from patrol, snatched a sword from the rack. Dan stepped out from behind the hearth. Lily spoke quickly and incoherently. Hunters in the forest, 3 of them. They almost caught me. A woman saved me, a stranger. She's here. Dan looked at the door. A woman was standing in the doorway, short, stocky, with deep shadows under her eyes. She was looking at the house, at the hearth, at the shelves, at the weapons rack, at the cat on the windowsill, at Dan. They looked at each other. Dan saw an Asian face, Korean. He would recognize it anywhere. The cheekbones, the slant of the eyes, the line of her jaw. A Korean woman, here, in Gehenna. She saw the same thing, an Asian face, Korean, in a stone house at the crossroads of 3 demonic roads. She spoke first, in Korean, clear and distinct. You are the fourth. Dan replied in Korean. The muscles in his mouth remembered those sounds, even though he hadn't spoken them in months. And you're the third. She nodded. Hana. Hana Chong. He nodded. Dan So. Silence. Yuna and Kaide and Lily and Mira stood and watched. They didn't understand a word, but they felt it. Two people from the same world, in a foreign one. They found each other. Dan pointed to the table. Sit down. She sat down. He went to the kitchen. His hands moved on their own. He didn't think. He didn't choose. His hands knew. Kimchi jjigae. Fermented root vegetables instead of kimchi. Sour and spicy and aromatic. Broth made from pork bones. Well, not exactly pork. From the bones of a hellish boar. But close. He didn't have any tofu. Instead of tofu, tender white mushrooms, diced. Red powder for color and heat. A pinch of sweet powder for balance. Green onions. An egg cracked right into the boiling soup. He set the bowl in front of Hana. She looked. Her eyes widened. She recognized it. Not the dish was different. She recognized the intention, recognized the form. She recognized the color and the smell and the steam and the way the egg floated in the red broth and the way the green onions lay on top in thin rings. She recognized home. Kimchi jjigae. Food from her childhood, from Koreatown, from that world she had left 12 years ago and to which she had never returned. She picked up a spoon. Her hand trembled. She scooped some up, brought it to her mouth, tasted it, closed her eyes. Her shoulders shook. She was crying. For the first time in 12 years. Silently, without a sound. Tears streamed down her cheeks and fell into the bowl. Salty tears in the spicy red broth. Dan sat across from her and said nothing. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say a word. He just sat there. She cried and ate and cried, until the last drop. Then she set down the bowl, wiped her face with her sleeve, looked at Dan, spoke in Korean. 12 years. I haven't cried in 12 years. He nodded. She continued. I was the third. I ended up here 12 years ago. I tried. I cooked. I thought food could change something. I couldn't. My people died, all of them, because of me. I quit the kitchen, went into the woods, became a herbalist. I've been living alone for 12 years. Dan listened. She spoke. And I heard about you. Rumors reached even my forest. A cook at the crossroads. A human. Feeding demons. I didn't want to come. I didn't want to see. Because if you can do it, that means I could have done it too. And I gave up. Dan was silent. Then he said, You didn't have anyone standing by your side. She looked up. He continued, I heard about the first three. You all tried to do it alone. I'm not alone. I have Yuna, Kaide, Lily, Mira, Grurg, hundreds of goblins, lizard folk, kobolds, vampires. I have a kitchen and a team and customers who'll stand up for me. You were alone. No one survives alone. Hannah was silent. Then she said quietly, You smell like kimchi jjigae and bone broth and home. I hate you for that. Dan smirked. Stay. She looked at him, at the kitchen, at the hearth, at the women standing by the wall who didn't understand a word but understood everything. She said, I'll think about it. She left. She came back the next day, and the next. On the third day, she came with a bag of herbs. She put it on the table. She said, Medicinal, for your kitchen, and for wounds. Kaide will come back today with a cut eyebrow. I saw her fighting on the northern road. An hour later, Kaide did indeed return with a cut eyebrow. Hannah treated the wound silently and professionally. Kaide looked at her with respect. Hannah stayed. The 6th month. The Kota Crossroads served 300 people a day. Dan had a team of 6 women, Yuna at the serving counter and in the dining hall, Kaide on security and patrols, Lily on procurement and inventory, Mira on seating, Hana on herbs and healing, Pika and Dorg on food prep. 2 new apprentices, a young lizard man named Shiro, whom Dan took on after he brought back perfectly identical fish from the underground river 3 days in a row. Precision and consistency, the qualities of an apprentice. And a goblin girl from a distant clan named Vora, who once tried to recreate his broth in her own cave. It didn't turn out well, but she tried. Initiative, a cook's quality. The menu has grown to 15 dishes, 3 types of ramen, miso, liver, and a new one. A clear broth made from chicken bones with a light citrus note from the yellow berries Hana found in the forest. Braised meat in 3 variations. Rice with various toppings, fermented appetizers, bread, and dessert. Rice balls with honey and nut beetles. Simple, sweet. The first dessert in the history of Gehenna. When Dan first brought them out into the hall and placed 1 ball next to each bowl, something unprecedented happened. The hall fell silent. 300 creatures fell silent at once, because none of them had ever eaten something sweet after the main course. The concept of dessert didn't exist. A meal ended when the plate was empty. And here, next to the bowl of ramen, lay a small ball, light in color, glistening with honey, with crunchy bits inside. The first to try it was an old goblin from the Gurga clan. He put the ball in his mouth, chewed, froze. An expression appeared on his face that Dan had never seen on a goblin before. Surprise. Pure, childlike surprise. Like a child seeing snow for the first time. Sweet. He had never eaten anything so sweet. After a meal. Like a gift. Like a period at the end of a good sentence. By evening, Yuna approached Dan and said that 3 goblins had been crying over the rice balls. Dan nodded. Seren came once a week, always alone, always in her travel clothes. Dan no longer cooked rice and eggs for her, something new every time. He watched, studied, what she liked, what made her eyes light up, what made her eat more slowly. She loved sour flavors. Fermented root vegetables with fish elicited a quiet sound from her, like a purr. She loved texture. Crunchy next to soft. Sautéed mushrooms on a bed of mushy rice. She didn't like sweet things. She took a bite of a rice ball with honey and set it aside. Dan remembered. On his next visit, instead of dessert, he gave her a handful of crispy, fermented seaweed sprinkled with red powder. She ate it all and looked at him with an expression that said, "You remembered." He remembered. He always remembered. By the 7th month, what Dan had both hoped for and feared came to pass. Arch-Inquisitor Cassius Wayne learned of the cook's existence. Dan found out from Hana. She had just returned from her evening patrol of the forest. Her face was gray. Her eyes were heavy. She said that her old contacts among the people beyond the rift had passed on the news. The Order of the Light Hunters had declared a crusade on the territory of Gehenna. The goal? The destruction of the creature known as the Cook. The man who betrayed his kind. A man who feeds the demons. The heart of corruption. Arch-Inquisitor Cassius Vane is personally leading the squad, 50 warriors, through the rift, through the western forest, to the crossroads. A 2-month journey, maybe 3. Dan listened. He looked at his people. All 6 were there. Yuna turned pale. Lily clenched her fists until they turned white. Kaide placed her hand on the hilt of the sword on the rack. Mira crossed her arms and muttered that this was to be expected. Hana was silent. Dan sat down at the table. He thought. 2 months. He had 2 months. He said, "We won't run away. The Kota Crossroads is here, so we're staying here." Kaide nodded. Yuna nodded. Lily nodded. Mira snorted, but nodded. Hana looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly in Korean, "My people didn't run away either. They stayed. and died. Dan replied in Korean, "Your people were alone. We have 300 clients a day, and the 3 houses know about us." Hana shook her head. 300 goblins and lizardmen won't stop 50 trained warriors of the order. Dan knew she was right. He said, "Then we need more than just goblins to protect us." The next morning, he sent 3 messages, one with a goblin runner to the south, for Serene, one with Kaide to the north, to the commander of the Velgrim plate-armored soldiers who said the broth was good, and one with Lily to the kobolds, to the caravanners of the middle houses. All 3 messages were identical. Koth's Crossroads invites you to dinner in 7 days. The replies came in 3 days. Saren replied first, "I'll be there." The commander replied via a note delivered by a plate-armored soldier, "Lord Velgrim will consider it." The caravanners replied that they would definitely come and asked if they could bring partners from the House of Thorn. 7 days later, 20 beings gathered at the crossroads of the cat. Saran with 2 kitsune bodyguards, a representative of House Velgrim, not the commander, someone higher up, an Oniko born in light armor with gold trim, an advisor, 2 caravanners from the middle houses, Grurg with 5 elders of the goblin clans, Nessa Kor with 2 vampires, an elder lizard man, and 4 kobolds who sat quietly in the corner looking at no one. Everyone had surrendered their weapons. Everyone sat down at the tables. Miro was seating them. This was her moment to shine. Serene next to Advisor Velgrim, both high-ranking. They can speak as equals. The caravanners away from the lizard man, last year's trade conflict. Grurg next to the kobolds, neutral toward each other. Nessu far away from everyone. Vampires prefer space. Dan had been cooking since morning, 6 hours, 6 dishes, each for a specific person. For Serene, rice with sautéed mushrooms and fermented root vegetables, crispy and tangy, her favorite. For Advisor Velgrim, rich meat ramen with thick noodles and a heavy broth, for a northerner used to hearty food. For the caravanners, braised meat with bread, road food, but better than any road food they've ever tasted. For Grurg, bone broth, the first broth, always the first broth. For Nessa, liver, always liver. For the kobolds, rice with egg, quiet, homely, their favorite. 20 creatures ate, in silence. At first in silence, then quietly. Then what Dan had seen 1,000 times in his father's restaurant began. People who eat good food start talking to each other. Not right away, not on purpose, but the broth loosens the throat, and the warmth loosens the shoulders, and the fullness loosens the face. And someone says something to their neighbor, and the neighbor replies. And 10 minutes later, a conversation is underway at the table. Saren was talking to Velgrim's advisor about the demonic steel mines. Quietly, without threats, like 2 people having lunch. Not like the heiress of the South and the representative of the North. The caravan driver was asking the lizard man about routes through the swamps. Nessa was listening to the goblin elder who was about cave systems. The kobolds spoke quietly with Grurg about the grain trade. Dan stood by the hearth and watched. 20 creatures, 5 races, 3 houses, at one table. No one spoke of peace. No one signed treaties. They simply ate and talked. And that was enough. After dinner, Saren approached him, quietly, so no one would hear. She said, "The order is coming for you. I know. My house knows. If you ask, my mother will send the guard." Dan looked at her. He asked, "And what will she ask for in return?" Saren paused. She said, "Nothing." Then, even more quietly, "That's all." Dan nodded. He understood. Protection from House Sharon means belonging to House Sharon. They came at dawn. Kaide saw them first. White cloaks in the morning mist. 50 figures on the western road. In formation. Swords, spears, shields bearing a broken sun. One in front. Tall, broad-shouldered, helmetless, dark hair streaked with gray, a stern face, gray eyes, a scar across his right eyebrow. Arch-Inquisitor Cassius Vane. Kaede ran into the house. She woke everyone up. Dan got dressed. He stepped out onto the porch. The fog lay over the crossroads. White figures moved through it like ghosts. Slowly, confidently. They had time. They had strength. They had faith. Dan looked at his people. Yuna stood beside him, pale but standing. Kaede to the right, sword in hand. Her face was stony. Lily was on the left, white as a wall, her hands pressed to her chest. Mira behind her, silent. Hana next to Mira, her eyes heavy. She had seen this before, 12 years ago, when they came for her people. And back then, they hadn't held out. But back then, she had been alone. Grurg emerged from the fog. Behind him, 40 goblins, with cleavers and spears and stones. They stood around the house, silent. Grurg approached Dan, looked at the white figures on the road, then at Dan, nodded. "We're here." The lizard folk followed, 20 of them, with short swords and shields made of armor. The elder lizard folk stood next to Grurg. He hissed quietly, "We're here too." Nessa Kor appeared with 5 vampires, all in battle armor, eyes red, teeth bared. Nessa looked at Dan. "In us." 20 kobolds, 10 mercenaries from the caravans that happened to be in the area, a shaggy demon with moose antlers, whom the magazine called Bob, and who came every day at exactly noon. He stepped out of the fog and stood by the wall of the house, and the ground shook with his footsteps. Dan watched. 100 creatures, maybe more. His customers, his regulars, those who came every day for a bowl of broth and ramen and rice with an egg. They stood around his house with weapons in their hands, ready to fight. For him. For the cook. For a bowl of soup. No, not for a bowl of soup. For a place. For the only place in Gahan where they were seen, where their names were remembered, where they knew they liked it spicy, or without onions, or with a double serving of bugs. For a place where they weren't goblins or lizard men or vampires, but Grurg and Nessa and Bob. Dan turned and went into the house. Yuna followed him. She asked, "What are you doing?" He replied, "Cooking." She froze. He repeated, "I'm cooking. They're fighting. I'm cooking. Everyone does what they're good at. I can't fight. I can make broth." He lit the second fire. He pulled out all the supplies. He set up 4 pots, 1 for each fire, and 2 over the coals. Yuna stood there for a second. Then she nodded. She stood next to him. She started chopping. Screams could be heard from outside, the clang of metal, a roar, the sound an enraged goblin makes when defending what is dear to him. Dan didn't turn around. He sliced the meat. Thin slices. Even. Identical. The wall of the house shook from the impact. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Dan didn't flinch. The broth came to a boil. He skimmed off the foam. The sounds of battle grew louder. Kaede shouted commands. Grurg roared. Something heavy slammed into the door. The wood cracked. Light poured through the gap. Dan was cooking noodles. Hana ran into the house, blood on her hands. Someone else's. She shouted. They'd broken through the left flank. Dan nodded, didn't turn around. The noodles had to cook for 3 minutes. Not 2, not 4, 3. Bob's roar echoed from outside, the kind of roar that makes the walls shake and pots fall from the shelves. Dan caught a pot of fermented mushrooms. He put it back. The battle had lasted an hour, maybe longer. Dan had lost track of time. He was cooking, frying, chopping, arranging. Yuna helped, silently. Tears streamed down her face, but her hands moved precisely and quickly. She sliced seaweed and cried. She sliced onions and cried, and she didn't stop. Then the noise subsided, not immediately, gradually. The shouts grew fewer, the clanging grew quieter, and finally, silence. Dan set the last bowl on the table. He turned toward the door. The door hung on a single hinge. A man stood in the doorway, tall, in a white cloak splattered with black, demonic blood. A sword in his hand, a stern face, gray eyes, a scar across his eyebrow. Cassius Vane. He had broken through the goblins, through the lizardmen, through the vampires, through Kaede, through Bob. Alone. He had broken through to the house, to the kitchen, to the cook. He stood in the doorway and looked at Dan. The sword was pointed forward. The blade trembled. Not from weakness, from rage. Or from something else. Dan stood by the hearth, unarmed. A towel draped over his shoulder, his hands in the broth up to his wrists. He looked at Cassius. He saw him, a tall man with a sword and fury in his eyes. But not only that, a tired man, a hungry man, a man who had walked for 2 months across a demonic continent with 50 warriors and a faith that was cracking at the seams. A man whose scar across his eyebrow was old, very old, the kind of scar you get when you're a child. Dan wiped his hands, slowly, calmly. He took a bowl, filled it with broth, the very broth he had been simmering all night. Bone broth, 20 hours worth, made from the best bones in the stockpile, with liver, with mushrooms, with Hannah's herbs, with love and time and patience. He put noodles in the bowl, meat, an egg, seaweed, onions, a drop of oil, a pinch of salt. He set the bowl on the table, right in front of Cassius. He looked him in the eyes. He said, "Sit down, eat, then kill me if you can." Cassius stood there, sword in hand, the bowl on the table, steam rising from the broth, the smell, warm, rich, meaty, homely. A smell that makes something inside tighten, something old and forgotten. Cassius looked at the bowl, at the steam, at the golden broth, at the yellow noodles, at the pink meat, at the runny egg yolk, at the green onion feathers, at a drop of oil glistening like a tiny sun. He lowered the sword, slowly. The tip touched the floor. He let go of the hilt. The sword fell with a clang. Cassius sat down, in front of the bowl. He placed his hands on the table. They were trembling. He picked up the chopsticks. His hands trembled harder. He brought the noodles to his mouth. He ate, chewed, swallowed, ate some more. Broth, meat, noodles, egg, seaweed. He ate and ate and ate, and stopped halfway through the bowl. The chopsticks froze. His face changed. The stiffness was gone, like a mask that had been removed. Beneath the mask was the face of a boy, a 10-year-old boy who had stood and watched his mother burn, who had joined the order to change something from within, and had broken, and became the one who sets other mothers ablaze. Tears streamed from Cassius Wayne's gray eyes, quiet, salty. He cried and ate and cried, like Hana over kimchi jjigae, like Serion over rice with egg, like Grurg over his first bowl of broth, like everyone who sat down at this table and received what they hadn't expected. Not food, attention, memory, warmth. Cassius finished eating. He set down his bowl, wiped his face with the sleeve of his white coat splattered with black blood. He looked at Dan. Dan stood by the hearth, silently. He looked at him, without malice, without fear, without triumph. Just looking, like a cook looks at a customer who has finally eaten. Cassius said hoarsely, "My mother, she cooked. Simple food. Root vegetable soup, bread, nothing special. But she cooked for me, every morning, until the order came and said she was a witch. And I stood there and watched. I was 10. Dan listened. Cassius continued, "Your soup, it smells like her kitchen. I don't remember her face, but I remember the smell. I've remembered the smell for 20 years. He fell silent. Dan walked over to the table, sat down across from him, said, "You can stay." Cassius looked at him. Dan continued, "Not as a hunter, not as an arch-inquisitor, as a man who needs a bowl of soup and a place to sit." Cassius was silent. Footsteps sounded behind the door. Kaede entered, blood on her face, a sword in her hand. She saw Cassius. She raised her sword. Dan raised his hand. "Don't." Kaede froze. She looked at Dan, at Cassius, at the empty bowl, at the fallen sword. She lowered hers. She stepped back toward the wall. She stood and watched, ready for anything. Cassius stood up. He picked up his sword. Dan didn't move. Cassius turned the sword so the hilt was facing forward. He held it out to Dan. Dan didn't take it. He pointed to the stand by the door. Cassius looked at the stand, at the goblin cleavers, at the mercenary's swords, at Grurg's dagger. He placed his sword next to it, the hunter's heavy blade next to a rusty goblin knife. He turned to Dan. He said, "I'll stay until morning." Dan nodded. Until morning. Outside, the wounded were moaning. Hannah was already running among them, bandaging, healing. The goblins, lizard men, vampires, and hunters, those who lay there and couldn't get up. She healed everyone, without distinction, because a wounded person is a wounded person, because Hannah was a healer, and a healer doesn't choose. The morning after the assault was quiet. Dan stepped out onto the porch. The crossroads were torn up. Stones had been moved. The ground was plowed up. Traces of blood, black, demonic blood, and red, human blood. The house stood. The walls had held. The door hung on a single hinge. One window was broken. The roof was intact. The hearth was burning. The blue flame was steady and quiet, as always. Dan looked at the road. The hunters had left during the night. Those who could walk had carried those who couldn't and headed back west, without a leader. Cassius remained. He was sleeping on the floor by the wall, wrapped in his white cloak. In his sleep, his face was different, not hard, not fierce. The face of a weary man who, for the first time in 20 years, was sleeping not on a camp cot next to his sword, but on the kitchen floor next to the hearth. Dan stepped over him. He went to check. Grurg was sitting by the wall of the house. His left arm was bandaged. His cleaver lay nearby. He saw Dan, nodded, alive. His goblins had lost 4, 14 wounded. Dan pressed his lips together. 4 dead. For his house. For his kitchen. For a bowl of broth. Grurg saw his face, shook his head, spoke slowly and hoarsely. "Not for the broth. For the place. Our place. The first in 100 years. Dan stood and looked at the old goblin with his bandaged arm. He nodded. He walked on. The lizard folk had lost 2. Nessa Kor had been struck in the thigh with a sword. Hannah stitched up the wound. Nessa lay against the wall, cursing under her breath. Bob was unharmed. Not a scratch remained on his hide. The hunter's swords bounced off him like a stone wall. He sat by the house, holding a clay cup carefully between 2 massive fingers. Yuna brought him tea. Herbal, made with Hannah's herbs. Bob drank in small sips and watched the dawn. Kaede stood by what was left of the door. The blood on her face had dried. Her sword was in its sheath behind her back. She hadn't slept all night. She'd stood guard. She'd waited. They hadn't returned. Dan walked up to her. He looked at her face, at the dried blood, at the shadows under her eyes. He said, "Go to sleep." She shook her head. He said, "This isn't a request. Go to sleep. I'll keep watch at the door." She looked at him, at the small, unarmed man with a towel slung over his shoulder. She snorted. For the first time in a day, something stirred on her stony face. She went into the utility room. Dan stood by the door. He looked at the intersection, at the 3 roads leading in different directions, at the traces of battle, at the morning mist dissipating over the rocks. He stood there for an hour. Then he returned to the kitchen. He needed to make broth. He needed to feed the wounded. He needed to feed those who had defended them. He needed to work. By noon, Cat's Crossroads had opened. The door was propped open with a log. The window was covered with a hide. Dan stood by the hearth. Yuna was at the counter. Pico was slicing. Dorg was frying. Lily was counting the remaining supplies. Mira stood at the entrance and showed people to their seats. Hana was bandaging the last of the wounded. Goblins came in for lunch. Lizard folk, kobolds, vampires. Just like every day. As if nothing had happened. As if there hadn't been a battle here at dawn. They came in, handed over their weapons, sat down, and ate. Because broth is needed every day. Because hunger knows no truce. Because life goes on. Cassius woke up around noon. He stepped out of the back room. The goblin at the entrance saw the white cloak and growled. Kaede, who had already stood up, placed her hand on her sword. Dan looked up from the cauldron. He said one word. No. The goblin fell silent. Kaede withdrew her hand. Cassius stood in the hall. Seated around him, eating, were those he had come to destroy. Goblins, lizard folk, vampires, half-breeds. All those whom the Order called vile. They were eating broth and ramen and rice with egg, and he stood among them without a sword and without a cloak, because the cloak had been taken off and placed in the corner. And without it, he was just a man. Tall, tired, hungry. Dan set a bowl in front of him, morning broth, light, clear, with an egg and green onions. Not yesterday's heavy ramen, morning broth. For a man who had just woken up and who needed something simple and warm today. Cassius sat down. He ate. The goblin at the next table was eyeing him. The lizard man opposite him hissed quietly, but no one moved. There was one rule. Whoever comes, eats. Everyone is equal. Cassius finished eating. He looked at Dan. He said, "My order will declare me a heretic." Dan nodded. Cassius continued, "I have nowhere to go." Dan was silent. Cassius asked quietly, "Can I stay?" Dan looked at him, at the scar across his eyebrow, at the gray eyes that held no anger. There was emptiness, and in that emptiness, something small and fragile, something like hope. Dan said, "You know how to peel potatoes." Cassius blinked. Dan pointed to the sack of root vegetables by the wall. "Sit down, peel them." Cassius Wayne, Arch-Inquisitor, the terror of demons, the man before whom armies trembled. He sat down on the floor. He picked up a potato. He picked up a knife and began to peel. Crooked, thick, with huge losses of flesh. Dan watched. He shook his head. He sat down next to him. He showed him. Thinner, smoother, following the curve of the root. "Not bad." Cassius tried. "Better. One more time. Even better." Yuna peeked from behind the door and bit her fist to keep from laughing. Or from crying. Or both. A week passed. Then another. Cassius didn't leave. He peeled root vegetables, washed bowls, carried water, chopped wood, did everything he was told, silently, without complaint, from morning till night. The goblins stopped growling at the sight of him. The lizard folk stopped hissing. Nessa Kor once sat down at the table next to him. They ate in silence, side by side, the former Arch-Inquisitor and the vampire, with bowls of the same broth. The third week after the assault, Dan received 3 messages at once, all 3 from the Lords: House Sharon, House Welgrim, House Erebus Bone. All 3 with the same question. The cook invites you to dinner. Dan read them. He looked at Yuna. He looked at Kaede, at Lily, at Mira, at Hana, at Cassius, who was standing in the corner wiping a bowl with a rag. He said, 3 lords want to come to dinner. Silence. Mira sat up straight, her eyes lit up. She said, the seating arrangement will be tricky. Dan smiled. Dinner in 7 days. Let's get ready. 7 days. Dan prepared ingredients, recipes, each dish for a specific guest. He asked everyone questions. Serene told him about her mother, Shireen, 9-tailed, ancient, refined, eats only light and exquisite fare. Kaede told him about Velgrim, rough, direct, loves meat and bread, hates frills. Hana told him about Erebus the Bone, the eldest of the lords. His body is half ruined, can only eat liquids. 3 lords, 3 dishes, 3 hits on the target, otherwise it won't work. Dinner time. The table is set. 3 seats, 3 bowls, 3 sets of chopsticks. Mira arranged everything herself. Velgrim on the left, Shireen on the right, Erebus in the center, a neutral center between the northern fire and the southern ice. They arrived, not at the same time. Velgrim first, huge, horns like a bull's, red skin, red eyes. He filled half the room. He looked at the weapons rack. He took down a battle axe. He set it down. He sat down. Sharon was second, 9 tails, golden eyes, an ancient face that looked 30. She walked in and the air grew 5 degrees warmer. She looked at Velgrim's axe on the rack. She placed her fan next to it. The fan was a weapon. Dan had no doubt. Erebus was last. 2 servants carried him in. Thin, almost a skeleton in a robe. A face like a skull covered in skin. Eyes burning with green fire in empty sockets. Ancient, terrifying. He looked at Dan. Dan looked at him. He didn't look away. Erebus sat down. 3 lords at one table, for the first time in 70 years. Dan brought out the dishes. In front of Velgrim, a rich roast, meat in large chunks, braised for 8 hours, tender as butter, in a thick, dark sauce made from fermented mushrooms. Bread, warm, fresh, heat and strength and simplicity. Velgrim looked, nodded, began to eat. In front of Sharon, tender duck, not duck, a local bird with a long neck. But Dan had prepared it like Peking duck. Thin, crispy skin, tender meat, a delicate berry sauce with honey and a hint of acidity. Beside it, the thinnest white flour crepes. Sharon raised an eyebrow. She picked up a crepe, placed a piece of the bird on it, rolled it up, took a bite. 9 tails froze simultaneously. Before Erebus, a clear broth, as pure as a mountain stream. But the taste of 24 hours of simmering, a taste gathered from bones and herbs and mushrooms and patience, strained 5 times and brought to absolute clarity. A single sprig of gray mint floated in the broth, nothing else. Erebus lifted the bowl with bony fingers, brought it to what had once been his mouth, drank, slowly. Green lights flickered in his eye sockets. The 3 lords ate, in silence. Dan stood by the wall. Yuna stood by the door. Kaede stood guard. Lily was in the back room, counting something. Mira stood in the corner, making sure no one encroached on the table's space. Hannah was by the window. Silence. Only the sounds of eating. Velgrim ate greedily and noisily. Sharon ate neatly and slowly. Erebus ate silently. 3 different styles, 3 different worlds, 1 table. When Velgrim finished eating, he leaned back. He looked at his empty plate, then at Sharon, then at Erebus. The 3 lords of demons looked at one another, in silence. For the first time in 70 years, they were in the same room, and no one had died. And then the door creaked. Cassius entered, without a cloak, in a simple shirt, flour on his hands. His face bore the marks of kitchen work. He carried a scorched bundle of cloth in his hands, an inquisitor's robe. He laid the robe on the floor. He looked at the three lords. The three lords looked at the man, at the former arch-inquisitor, at the one who had waged war against their people. Cassius sat down in the empty seat. He spoke quietly. "I am no longer the Grand Inquisitor. The Order has declared me a heretic. I have nowhere to go. May I have something to eat?" Silence. Velgrim clenched his fists. Sharon narrowed her eyes. Erebus watched. The green lights burned steadily. Dan stepped out of the shadows. He was carrying a fourth bowl. Ramen. Plain miso ramen. He set it down in front of Cassius. He returned to the kitchen. The three lords looked at their former enemy. Cassius stared into the bowl. Lord Erebus, the Bone Lord, whose house had lost 18,000 souls in the wars with the Order, slowly reached his bony hand across the table. In his hand was a salt shaker. He placed it in front of Cassius. He said in a voice that sounded like the wind in an empty well, "It's tasteless without salt." Cassius took the salt shaker. He salted the broth. He ate. Yuna peeked through the door. Tears streamed down her face. She covered her mouth with her hand to keep from sobbing. Dan stood by the window. He looked at the snow. The first snow in Gahanra. White flakes fell on the stone crossroads, at the three-way intersection, on the roof of the house, on the weapons rack where the Lord of the North's axe lay next to the Lord of the South's fan and the former Arch-Inquisitor's sword. He looked at the snow and felt, for the first time in a year, that maybe it would work out. He returned to the table, the fifth bowl, for himself, because the host must also eat with his guests. He sat down, picked up his chopsticks. 5 figures at the table, 3 lords of demons, the former Arch-Inquisitor, a chef from Los Angeles. Steam from the 5 bowls rose toward the black basalt ceiling. Snow outside the window, blue fire in the hearth, a black cat on the windowsill. Silence. Dan ate his ramen. It was good. There was 11 months away, but tonight 3 lords, 1 former enemy, and 1 cook were eating at the same table. And that was enough. For today, that was enough.